Chapter 22. The Deathly Hallows. Chapter text Philosopher's Stone and Prisoner of Azkaban are the only two books that don't get their book titles as chapter titles, when they totally could have worked in book just fine. Just trade out Nicola's Flamel and the Dementor's Kiss. HP. I don't know how many more hair's breadths of death I can live through before you land here already, James said wearily, as he eyed the book still hanging from Lily's limp fingers. Seems he still has an adventure or two to go without us. Sirius noted the quickly growing shift in the pages across the spine. Maybe we'll get lucky, and he still stumbles across one more Horcrux. Harry, lost in thought for a moment as he tried to guess if Luna and everyone were okay from everything he'd left behind, was pulled back to try and agree hopefully. When Hickory came over and began swatting curiously at the book, James finally took it away and began with a protective air around his son once more. Deja vu anyone? Remus asked with a forced smile. So long as no one got splinched this time, I'll take it, Harry shivered. Why am I not surprised Hermione does I told you so's, even when that person isn't around, Lily chuckled. She probably even does it to herself in the mirror, James smirked. James' smile vanished at once, as did everyone's, as they remembered Luna and her father's situation. They really couldn't say what served him right. Now I'm wondering if the Weasleys might pop over to the Lovegoods to find out what that was. Remus winced in concern. Surely they'd have seen something going on in the distance and gone over to check on him. Bit of a blessing in disguise for them. Sirius looked a tad amused at the news they'd be receiving for that. Confirmation at least Hermione and Harry's still alive, and well at least. Harry's breath caught painfully in his throat. He almost blacked out for a second in fear. The idea was as unbearable as if he'd have to watch his own parents be murdered again. They meant too much to him. The worst part was, Ginny was already in their control and could go the same way as Luna any second. James abandoned the book for as long as it took to calm Harry back down. Their feelings of being replaced in his life would never stop them doing all they could while their son was in their grasp. It was agonizing they could do no more than keep going for an answer. The feeling of uselessness circling around them, just like Harry's fears, had no hope of leaving. Sirius put a painful smile in place for Harry's joke. He tried to join in, tell him he'd be willing to go just for that, but it wouldn't come out, and he was left with the urge to be sick. Remus almost wanted to laugh at Harry saying that about a tent, even his living conditions had never been so poor, but now he was wondering if he should just invest in one of these. I think he was actually multitasking and doing both at once, Lily disagreed. He had no reason to lie while keeping you there. Plus, he's clearly not a very good on-the-spot liar, James agreed. Not that this was his biggest offense anymore, but it had still stood out to him. It takes talent, Sirius said smugly. I guess you lot had to be naturally good at something. Lily rolled her eyes. Really? James chuckled in surprise. I've heard far more insane things you lot have lived through than some extraordinary objects based around a kid's tale. My point exactly, he finished in an uneasy mutter, that being one he could have lived without. She keeps saying that as if she's not in a tent that defies Muggle laws of what space is. Lily shook her head. All of them were looking torn between exasperation and amusement now. This girl had done fantastical feats of magic herself. If someone sat her down and told her all of the stories she'd lived through before she experienced them, she likely still wouldn't have believed them until they came to pass. And still, she insisted on saying not everything had a chance of being real. But some magic can keep you immortal, and there's even some ways of getting you half there, Remus reminded with an uneasy shiver, thinking of both the Philosopher's Stone again and the ghosts of the castle. They weren't perfect answers, but flawed attempts that were quite real. James' voice shook hard for the reminder he hadn't needed. Every minute they'd spent doing this, he was painfully aware that was the only way he could ever be there for his son again. The stone didn't seem to either, Lily reminded no one, the most vivid part of that tale still making her shiver with unease, as a man had committed suicide to more properly be with his love. Clearly the resurrection stone was no more a real means to bring back the dead than any ghost she'd met. She did, for 6 years. Sirius balked. I think Hermione might have been imagining something a bit more crude, Harry offered in her defense. Closer to an inferi, maybe, he finished with a grimace of his own. Well, if you have to try, you're clearly not succeeding, Remus snorted. So why do the Potters claim to have a link? Harry asked his dad eagerly. The fact that he could without him having to be some perverse ghost of any kind never lost on him, but especially in this moment when he'd been so desperate in his memory. James saw the intensity Harry asked and tried to be studious in his answer, even if he was starting to believe this himself. He also didn't want to be the reason Harry was let down if he was wrong. A few guesses and missing people, some questionable maiden names to take a gander at. Harry nodded slowly to show he was taking in every word, but his excitement was rising even faster than he could hide it now. Why on earth do you remember that? Lily asked in surprise. Of all the things that happened in that house, Merope's detailed, pitiful life had stood out more than the nonsense that Gaunt was shouting. I tried to remember everything about those memories, Harry shrugged. That I do remember, Sirius gave a malicious smile, still wishing Ogden was around to thank him for how he handled all of that. I didn't even register the name at the time, though, Remus shrugged. I did, James said offhand. Just didn't bother to point it out. There were other things going on. Harry had an odd look on his face as he realized this actually made him distantly related to Voldemort. He quickly waved that away, as he knew the connection was as flimsy as being related to Ginny by blood as well. It's not. Impossible, Lily said slowly. Do you think he ever used it for that, though? James asked. I can't see him mourning over anyone enough to use it. Maybe Slytherin himself, Sirius offered. If Harry's right, then I doubt he realized it, seeing as Voldemort turned it into a Horcrux. I don't think he's got enough poetic flair to make a stone to bring back the dead an item to preserve his soul from dying, Remus finished with an eye roll. If, Harry protested. You're trying to draw a lot of fantastical ideas into your point of view of the world after having heard the story an hour ago, Remus cautioned. Nothing you've said seems wrong, but it is rather out there as well, the odds of all this alone, he finished in exasperation. Harry had somehow managed to handle two of these objects without ever knowing it. Harry didn't seem particularly put off by this, though. He was long since used to fantastical things happening to him. True, you might not be able to mend it like normal, James said, bringing us back to Dumbledore and making me question what his involvement in all this still is, Lily sighed. He'd started Harry on this side quest with that symbol in Hermione's book, but what did all of this mean to him? Why? Sirius pouted. That was a legitimate question. You lot just shoved the Horcrux back in Hermione's bag, right? The shell, the locket's still there, though. A priceless Slytherin artifact, just with a hole in it now. What if the ring, the stone, whatever, is still lying around Dumbledore's office somewhere? I can see him keeping it around just in case. All you've got to do is go up there and get it. That would be a complete waste of time, Sirius, Remus protested. This has gone on long enough as a little distraction. They still need to focus on finding the Horcruxes they don't know about. This could help, though, Sirius insisted. They could snoop around the office and check to see if something else pops out. If Dumbledore left a clue for Harry, my money would be there. Remus still didn't look particularly convinced. It felt extremely dangerous for a possibility, but that was nothing new of this task. Harry in particular looked intrigued, feeling at least safe in the knowledge hearing this didn't pain his mind, making him at least hope he did go back to his first home soon. James couldn't help reading that in a grave tone. He didn't even try to hide it. Mind on his infant and his son now, what he would give so that would always be true. Harry watched, and finally understood his dad's real interest in the Hallows. It was no childish desire for a fairy tale to be real, and he was as touched as he was worried he'd now let his dad down. Despite all the boiling emotions simmering in him for every conversation coming back to him regarding this, he still could not imagine an answer in sight. James looked rather curious at the way Harry phrased that. No one's ever cast a spell at me while under the cloak. You think it would? What deflected? Makes sense, Sirius shrugged. The wand makes you unbeatable, the cloak makes it so no one can even try. And what? Remus snorted. The stone is a warning what'll happen if you challenge that person. So, do you want to test it? Lily asked. James hesitated answering. He didn't like the concept of throwing even a minor spell at any of them under it, but now couldn't shake the idea. Harry started tapping his foot impatiently at their indecision and finally blurted out, We've got ages to try that later. Can't we focus on this for now? James agreed it could be a topic for another time. James froze up with a look of deep concentration for a few moments before he said slowly, I guess. It doesn't make any less sense than him, simply borrowing it for the order. Yes, checking to see if it's a cloak of legend makes far more sense than the man simply using it to help others, Lily snorted. If I'd told him how long it had been in my family, and his mind would go back to this tale he'd loved as a kid so much, James shrugged off. But now anger at Dumbledore was again rising if this were true. If in fact Lily and Harry would have been safe from Voldemort had he never done such a thing. Lily realized the same and reached over to take his hand, trying to remind through touch alone their deaths were at Voldemort's feet. For all his faults, their old headmaster would not have left them for dead had he known. She still firmly believed that. James squeezed her hand as answer, but his voice was still shaking as he continued. Something you have been needing lately, Remus said with civility. Great moral boost as an idea, Sirius agreed calmly. Harry scowled at the two trying to downplay this, unlike his dad who was only growing more confident in this the more Harry spun the tale. But why? Lily asked, eyes nearly popping out of her head in concern for that idea. What good would it do? So Harry could ask him, Remus offered awkwardly. Dumbledore would have wrote his will before he died, Moony. Sirius rolled his eyes while reminding. Just brings us back to what we were joking about earlier, James said slowly. Dumbledore was planning on doing this with Harry at some point. You lot are really going along with this, Lily yelped. I'm sorry, Harry, but even if that ring was the stone, when and why would Dumbledore have discovered this, done all of this, without telling you? We've been asking that from the beginning, Harry reminded bleakly. You think? James just looked more amused than instantly on board with this one. Dumbledore's old buddy would have the same knowledge of the Hallows, I presume, Remus hedged. This is assuming that's why he signed his name like that, and it doesn't have some secret meaning between the two, which you're still ignoring, Harry. Remember, he was stealing something from Gregorovitch, Lily recalled. Maybe that old wand maker did have notes or something over this wand, boasted one too many times, and now Grindelwald has a death sentence for it. Why would Voldemort know about this, though? Sirius protested. I doubt those muggles were reading him this kid's story, and Riddle was as likely as any student to sleep through history of magic as anyone. He's looking for a way to beat my wand, Harry eagerly reminded. He's torturing Ollivander, who definitely would have known about this. He winced slightly and rubbed at his temple, but was so eager to just talk about this he easily ignored the feeling. Gave Voldemort a wild goose chase, I like it, James finished, even more amused than ever. I doubt anyone takes that literally, Sirius disagreed. Remember, Dumbledore explained why the Philosopher's Stone wouldn't have appealed to him any more than these three things. He'd be dependent on always having them for his existence to last. Harry hesitated without answer, and James kept going for the rebuttal he clearly didn't want to say. Sirius sighed, but didn't bother to repeat himself. Harry, I'm worried you're going too far into this, Lily frowned at him. I still don't see why you're badgering on about this. What good's it going to do you? You've no more idea of the validity of this myth than Lovegood. Dumbledore. Harry finally said his name again with excitement, rather than that bitter trace of resentment. Maybe this was, I don't know, a contingency all along. In case something happened to him, he wanted us to find these, so that I'd still have a way to fight Voldemort. It all fits. Why else would he have left us all that stuff? What does the Deluminator have to do with the Hallows? Remus asked. Harry frowned hard in concentration, and his dad came to his rescue. Ron figured out how it worked by accident, but what if it can be used to help you find more than just people? What if Harry actually asked that thing to take them to the Hallows? That would mean Dumbledore already knows where the wand is. Lily frowned at him. I'd bloody hope he'd just leave that to Harry instead. I don't know, I was just trying to help, James finally admitted, while Harry face-palmed he'd never thought to try this, the powerful feeling swirling inside him nearly tipping him face, first to the ground. They really should have tested the usefulness of that Deluminator more. You certainly seem to think so, Remus kindly reminded. They're still working up to believing this at all. Harry scowled again, but stopped himself from snapping he'd never been wrong before, his many mistakes of the past flying through his mind, reason enough why he was almost glad he hadn't goaded his friends into following him along blindly with this. Sirius snorted and eyed Lily, who only sighed in resignation as he loudly said, Well, look at there, Lily. I always knew you were the most practical of us. Not enough to kick your ruddy arse when needed, she huffed. That's far more light-hearted than what I would have said. Remus shook his head. Does that mean we're cheating? Sirius grinned at the thought. Learning this from you. I accept that, James snorted. James burst out laughing for that, Hermione's own words biting her in the butt childishly delighting him. She's got you there. James was quick to remind when Harry eyed him in particular. At least multitask, son. You've got at least 2 more Horcruxes to identify, let alone tracking them all down. Now Nagini's apparently off doing her own thing from time to time, and that's both a good and bad thing, Lily sighed. He did also leave Hermione that book, and I can't think what other reason he'd have for that, Sirius pointed out. Whose side are you on? Remus demanded. All of them, it's more fun, he shrugged. Harry bit his lip to stop himself, saying he wouldn't need to if he were master of death himself, but even to his own ears the words sounded childish. I open at the close, Lily repeated to herself. The close of death, that's what this thing's surrounded by. It didn't open in Godric's Hollow, where a lot of death is associated, Remus said with his own shiver for the reminder. Dumbledore's tomb would just be bloody morbid, Sirius rolled his eyes. I still can't think of what else it would refer to, James agreed. Because that's what Ron needs so soon after his return, to be put in the middle of this, Lily huffed. And again, we see the product of you lot taking Dumbledore way too literally, Remus groaned. You don't want me going after these either, Harry reminded. I think you need to focus on the Horcruxes, but instead of falling into a rut like you did the last time you solely did that, these wouldn't make a bad side project. Harry nodded slightly. Even as he disagreed, he could already feel his mind clouding over with his want for these. The Horcruxes didn't have to be the singular answer. Something we've all wanted, and seem less likely to get by the minute, James groaned. The allegations he had every intention of throwing at Dumbledore mere days ago felt laughable now, as he was brutally reminded the man hadn't done any of this yet. Why would you try talking to it? Sirius asked in surprise. I don't suppose it'll open at the close of a sentence. Now I think you lot are taking the wording too literally, Harry reminded. I was trying everything I could think of. The results were about as good as his golden egg had been, and he was no less frustrated by this. Harry watched those around him grimace, clearly not liking that at all. He was about to begin a very snide defense for himself, but James beat him to the punch. We know you don't want it for the same reasons, but glory Harry, did you have to put that in as horrid a way as possible? James was starting to regret his own desire for these things now. Harry didn't say any more, once again his past coming back to him and reminding of all the disastrous consequences of him and Voldemort seeking out the same goal. For all he knew, the conclusion to this one would never come. Sirius burrowed deeper into his seat and said mournfully to no one, I really wish you'd stop thinking that. I liked our assumption better, and she's being held prisoner at Hogwarts. I'll take Death Eaters over Dementors any day. Harry longed to apologize, but it all fell flat in his head, emotionless, as his godfather speaking had been a mere flicker in his suddenly seized mind for his desire over these things. James began shifting anxiously for Harry's relentlessness of this now. If it had been just over the stone, he knew he would have understood more, and he still maintained he wanted these for his son for their protection of keeping him safe. But not to this degree. It was all Harry would think of. Hadn't their first few months proven how toxic this could be? Harry, Lily finally said sharply. This isn't right, and you know it. I'm worried, love, she finished hastily as she saw him starting to get defensive. If you split off after them for this mad quest and something happened. She trailed off, and Harry didn't need her to say more. He simply flushed and let the shame wash over him for how he very possibly could have done what Ron once had for an even more selfish reason all, because he chose now of all times to isolate. He refused to ever do that again, and forced himself to pay more attention to those around him, finally seeing the worry in them and feeling even worse for it. You know, when things are all kinds of wonky when I'm on Hermione's side. Sirius side. James finished that last word with almost a pained yelp as he turned to his son, who now sunk even lower into his seat and couldn't explain properly how he'd worked that out in his fevered visions. More likely, Remus was quick to break the tension. After that incident with Nagini, he might have realized he'd stopped employing occlumency against you and is back to doing that. Harry didn't want to speak for or against this idea, afraid he'd come across even more crazy than he already felt. James popped Harry upside the head and muttered about his flawed logic. Harry held his wand protectively to him now, and reasoned what he hadn't been capable of at the time. His scar had not burned when he'd first taken it. The connection they shared hadn't even been truly felt until years later. I always knew he had it in him, Lily smiled. Can't captain all of those chess wins without knowing something about strategy. Harry just loves to hog all the glory in bossing others around, Sirius smirked. Something else he inherited from both parents. He'd been hoping Harry would give a much better reaction than just trying to laugh him off, so made Lily and James roll their eyes at him for nothing. As good a reason as any, James sighed, resisting the urge to smack Harry again for becoming ever more lackluster. He was well aware Harry couldn't help it in here, and snapping at him would do no good, but it didn't make them worry any less about the state he could wind up in after all his memories were intact. Poor bloke's really stretching, Sirius rubbed at his neck, but failing to come up with any better answers himself still. Like miniature Death Eaters? Remus asked. Don't, Lily protested, picturing a bunch of teenagers dropping out of school because the Death Eaters there had inducted them to do just this. I wish Bill had been in this story more, Sirius smiled. All his siblings seemed to speak the world of him. Not very creative with these passwords, James pouted. Anyone trying to tune in would guess it has something to do with Dumbledore or Harry. Maybe not anymore, Sirius reminded. What with all the recent allegations against him, that was the whole purpose after all. If the Death Eaters are conceited enough to think it worked on every single person, so that no one believes in the idea of Dumbledore anymore, then they're even more idiotic than I thought, and that's saying a lot, Remus said. She does remember that's entirely unnecessary, yes? Lily asked in concern. Hence the just for something to do, Harry repeated. I'd rather she just keep rereading every book she has again. She may not be able to recite them all backwards yet, Sirius smirked. That's Lee Jordan. Harry cheered for those who couldn't remember hearing this voice. Well, we always said he was the best commentator, Sirius smirked at once. Now he's putting his skills to an even better use. Charming, Remus repeated with a snicker. Well, I'm loving this already, James chuckled. Well, at least they're smart about it, Remus laughed. And pretty random at that, Sirius cocked his head to the side. Why River? Old joke between him and the twins. There are plenty of rivers out there named Lee and Jordan, Lily shrugged. I guess a play on words. Whatever works for him, James waved on. James and Sirius let out such fantastic snorts of laughter, Lily grew concerned for their health for a moment. That's not Mooney, Sirius protested at once. Bloody hell, man, will you ever stop making fun of your name? It's my parents' fault, really, he said tragically. They set me up for all this shite. James was still laughing too hard. Tears were starting to appear in his eyes again, but for the first time in days because of happiness again. It took several long breaths before he could keep going, truly ecstatic now to see if they were right, hardly daring to think anything so good could happen at this rate as getting to hear anything from his last friend. His humor dried up in the same breath and came out in dread now of why Remus was really there. Bloody hell, poor Tonks, Sirius whispered. Even he wasn't sure who this was meant for, the pink-haired youth or the man himself. Remus felt the mad desire to start shouting at Lee for saying all this without proof. How on earth could he have known any of that? He didn't like any of the answers his mind was providing, like the order trying to step in and help a few moments too late. Lily clasped her hands painfully as she remembered discussing this very thing. Her heart went out to so many, and she still felt as useless as ever with no way in sight to save him, or even her own son from this future with so much left unexplained. James stuttered painfully over that rather underwhelming description of more dark magic than he ever could have conceived. Harry didn't need the little nudge from his dad. He'd had a lot of time in here to reflect on that poor decision, but as always wishing he could go back and change it would make no difference. It's Kingsley, Harry yelped. Now he's just using a shortened version of his name, Sirius sighed. Honestly, why doesn't everyone just come to Mooney for nicknames? He had to quickly modify at the end. You were just making fun of mine as well, Remus reminded with forced amusement. It's still better, Sirius promised. They can go stick their heads in a lion's mouth. James snapped at once. Or that, I actually like that better, he acquitted with a very pleased smirk. Just because you meant what Kingsley actually said doesn't count prongs, Sirius rolled his eyes. James kept going with almost painful anxiety now. The way that Remus had left Harry's life had been so harsh, the fight it had been around, he'd refused to dwell on it mainly because there was no answer Harry could give them. He'd half convinced himself the problem would remain unsolved, and he'd have to find some other way than this future's proof what a good thing Remus having kids could be. He wasn't all that convinced Mooney would air all of these problems over a radio, but even hearing he was still alive, and in contact with good people put just a little more of his mind at ease. Just hearing it confirmed, one silly little guess of theirs was right put such a genuine smile back in place for all of them. The room was almost unrecognizable from mere minutes ago. Remus clenched his jaw as he pictured not really knowing the answer, of once again having to choose between his own life and Harry. He still wasn't entirely convinced he'd done right this time. What good would he be doing sitting around worrying about Tonks, and doing nothing or helping Harry like he should have been? Serious smirk at Mooney said none too quietly about his idiot of a friend still managing to repeat himself. Remus tried and failed to ignore him. At least he was still doing some good even without knowing it. That had never really been a question, Remus told him in surprise. Even if I hadn't, reacted badly, I would like to think that Harry had to finally cut him off with an amused little laugh. Nearly always, Harry chuckled. You've got a rather large track record, which I only know half of, Remus shrugged. No, James screeched so loud Harry clasped his hands over his ears to protect them. That was bloody left out. Harry rubbed his ears to get feeling back in them even while he was grinning like a loon. Remus was still frozen and didn't seem to know how to react to this news. The horrid image of some Fenrir-like creature warring with the beautiful baby he could not ever wish for still spun horribly in his mind's eye. James spared a few moments to give him a pitying look before he read what was undeniably good news in his opinion. Yes, that tends to happen to one who's pregnant, Lily snorted. James, already on an emotional roller coaster from this dumping of news, nearly burst into tears at the father being across the cell from his daughter. Sirius made a series of spluttering noises that was either laughter or screams of protest. Honestly, I'm surprised that didn't happen sooner. James shivered at the past fight that had once happened because of Umbridge now taking place all over again. You've always been a killjoy. Sirius got his breath back and shoved Remus away from him. Remus retaliated by squashing up next to Sirius instead and scowling at him, saying, "You're just mad because you'd have been at attendance there." Sirius didn't bother to deny it. "I still don't see why they don't just call him Riddle," James sighed. "They might not know," Harry reminded. "Dumbledore certainly didn't make that information widespread, and I didn't tell them." "Not a bad substitution," Lily agreed. James didn't get that out very properly, never again able to break that word away from his life. But Harry was so excited to be shouting about it being one the twins he put it away anyways, and tried to keep going with the same amount of enjoyment. Then he reminded himself anyways that weasels were a rodent, that not all of them had to be such a terrible reminder for the rest of his life. "I like that better," Sirius said at once. "What's with all the R names?" Remus muttered, not really expecting an answer. "My personal favorite place for hiding out," Lily snickered. "Don't go giving him ideas," James protested. "Pleasant," Remus crinkled his nose even while fighting back a little more laughter. All four boys stopped to laugh at that. It sounded like an almost painful amount of relief being brought back around, Lily noticed sadly. She was so relieved to just finally getting a normal reaction again, she could do nothing but smile along herself. "Such blasphemy. I can't help but agree," Sirius said tragically. "That one's slightly better," James chuckled. "I understand they can't post exactly when they'll be back on air, but it's not a good thing they can't even allude to its potential," Lily worried. "Better safe than sorry," Remus assured. "Yet another reason I will never understand Dumbledore emphasizing your isolation," James finished quietly. He treated telling Ron and Hermione like some rare exception, and now Harry was carrying that through dangerously on. "Harry," Lily chided in exasperation. He held his hands up in surrender, and neither furthered their point. James had half forgotten about such a thing. It had never been a threat in their life, and they'd kept saying it in here with no reason not to. Now his blood ran cold as ice. His vision twisted painfully at what Harry had just brought down upon himself. "You will in a few seconds," Sirius managed to say in near hysteria as James threw the book to the floor in frustration. Chapter 23, Malfoy Manor. Chapter text. Hey look, James didn't get the chapter where someone died again. That's the last good news you'll be getting for a while. HP. James kicked the book across the room. It seemed every time they turned a page lately Harry was either getting into or just dodging another hellish event, and he was sick of it. That wasn't even counting the miserable time he'd spent suffering from the Horcrux, visiting his grave, and everything with Ron. He'd gotten only a second reprieve before they were plunged back. It slid nearly the length of the room and finally came to rest on the rug before the fireplace. Sirius dreaded it as much as anyone, but finally waved his wand to summon the book to him. There was an air no one expected to go away any time soon as he carefully found his place, eyeing the remaining pages that somehow never seemed to lessen their ordeal. Remus' face stretched comically, part indignation for Hermione losing her mind right now and half trying to fit this into some sort of understanding of why. "Vernon's not there," Sirius said automatically, flinching at himself for making a joke at a time like this when Harry needed to get out of there. "I'm sure that's actually the point," James muttered, wondering why she wasn't better at chess when she stayed so far ahead of them all like this. "He shouldn't be drawing attention to her," Lily whispered to no one, as really all three were in insurmountable danger here, but still Hermione would be the most expendable in their eyes when they realized who she was. Were they ever actually official? Remus tried for a weak little laugh, but then he saw Harry's face. A look of shock, recognition, but mostly disgust that was suddenly plain for remembering whose voice that was. Sirius retched at the end. He didn't need to see Harry mouthing that filthy name to guess. There were very few deplorable creatures who could speak like that. Remus was now convinced he was actually going to be sick. This monster from his childhood was what he envisioned from any child he sired. How could he ever have allowed such a thing? How could his friends think it anything like a good idea? Now Harry was back in those jaws' reach, and he'd still do anything to make that right. "Glad they agree," Lily muttered, fingers knotted painfully tight. Every spare thought she had nothing but hopes these kids could fib their way out of this long enough for some miracle to happen. "That's the first name you thought of?" Sirius demanded, looking nearly hysterical with laughter. "It was either that or Barney Weasley," Harry admitted, honestly regretting never having tried to impersonate more people in the past, though in his defense he'd never thought this would come up. "It's almost funny," James rasped along to spare Sirius looking like the only loon in the room. He couldn't get Harry's name right. Now Ron's using his name repeatedly. "That's slightly better," Remus giggled madly. It was a toss-up of invoking the Weasley name, who were notoriously close to Harry, or saving himself from being caught in another lie and raising further suspicion for his rather obvious looks. The girl Percy was dating. Lily slowly dredged up the memory of her name. "The one who was petrified with her that time, another Muggle-born," James protested. "She panicked," Harry reminded. "I'd love to see you lot come up with names on the spot." "Maximilian Mastiff," Sirius said practically before Harry had finished. "What?" he insisted to their blank looks. James admittedly just didn't have the patience to indulge him right now when he was more worried about Harry getting out of this, so just waved him on rather than responding. James groaned, the flare of panic turning his voice far harsher than he meant to. "You lot are terrible at this. Say it was a dare, bloody anything else than it just slipped your tongue." "I'm sorry," was all Harry could think to whisper, knowing full well he wouldn't have done any better. James winced and said in a much calmer voice, "You lot will get out of this. I'm sure it's all going to be fine in no time." There was just enough confidence in his voice. His son and friends could outsmart these idiots that he didn't have a strangle hold on him yet. Harry didn't look at all convinced. Fear was already bounding in him, almost more than he could stomach already, and he knew the worst hadn't even happened yet. "The obvious answer," Harry offered, which further eased James into actually smiling again. "Merlin's hell," Sirius spluttered, unable to believe of all the luck in this happening. "I can't believe this kid's popping up so much, when bloody Seamus was more notable as a dorm mate," Remus agreed. "I'm not complaining," Lily said in relief. "Good to know what happened to him." Sirius managed to read that with almost as much vile as he did Voldemort, that mangy brute was lucky he hadn't cut him down yet. Harry was none so subtly studying Remus as a distraction from his mind, nearly killing him with bright flashes of pain for remembering all this. The differences had already started astronomical and growing more every day. Lily let a wild laugh pass through her lips, remembering her shock at a little second-year girl being able to brew such an advanced potion to make all this possible. After everything that had been done since then, looking back on that was far more than just hilarious. Or a very nosy student, or a student that has a Slytherin friend that could have told them all that, Remus muttered quietly, admittedly not hoping this monster realized these alternatives, but unable to help himself. Lily ground her teeth for that insult to her childhood wish. It stung too close to home of wannabe Death Eaters shouting that in her face as she hung around her once friend. James clasped his hands together in thanks for imbeciles. They really were more useful than just test dummies. It can't be that easy. Please let it be that easy. Remus whispered the nonsense. Why? Sirius wasn't any more able to stop throwing sarcasm in their face than they could produce their own logic. Seems to me he'd be more annoyed you snatched up his kid on an innocent camping trip. James shifted uneasily for who they were more likely to run into there, Arthur, who would see his son and likely give the gig up that second. Any number of things could go wrong in there long before Harry's lie was detected. Ugh! Harry loudly protested at nothing. This is what I meant about leaving stuff lying around. Hermione wasn't here to vent at, and even if she had been, he instantly felt bad for his outburst anyways. You wouldn't believe him if he told you, Remus said deadpan. Not least of which because he doesn't know himself. Sirius tacked on. Harry, no, that's not. James cut himself off this time and just put his face in his hands, beyond words now at his son's poor lying skills. I think Voldemort found Grindelwald, Lily whispered to no one, as if they needed something else going on right now. Sirius went pure white by the time he finished that. His instinct to throw the book aside and have his wand at the ready like prongs had now an internal battle he was having to fight off as much as Harry. There was no longer any possibility this was going to end well. Oh, is that all the motivation you needed? Remus asked numbly, and hardly realized he never got an answer. There was no more life left in any of them. To say Harry should have lied his way out of this, to somehow fight his way free. There was only the deadly calm acceptance of what they knew Harry was now going to live through as he suffered the wake of this discovery, and the only nightmare left was how he got out of this one. Sirius could hardly keep track of the words flying from his mouth, his mind so disjointed with worry nearly crippling his throat for what they were going to do to his godson, let alone what Voldemort was up to now of all times. And Voldemort's not there right now. James breathed the one good sign in all of this. James almost wanted to laugh at that. A very crude sort of noise he only reserved for the blackest humor, that even Voldemort would never see this unhinged animal as anything but that, and the megalomaniac clearly needed a better leash for his pet. You certainly will be, Sirius vowed. Harry nearly set the book aflame in Sirius' hands. Not Hermione. He didn't want anyone so much as looking at her. Only his mother grabbing his arm stopped him. He hadn't meant to go for his wand, but thankfully no one thought twice of his slip in the heat of his moment. It's all going to crush that empty skull of yours before you ever get your hands on it, Lily snarled. The mongrel had already come far closer to Harry than any of them ever would have had nightmares about. It only continued to grow worse every second this dragged out. Only a moment, they all knew. Even with distance being a factor, apparition would make this stint become more lethal every second he was there. At least now we know their password. Sirius stalled any more of this by half shrieking that. James honestly considered for a moment laughing at that, for Malfoy to still have such grandiose things around even in this time was beyond him. Go piss on a rug and rub your own nose in it, Sirius seethed. Does she think Harry's obsession with him last year turned into a two-way thing? Lily muttered sarcastically, but it fell flat without even the hint of hope Narcissa could be wrong. Draco would indeed recognize Harry as surely as Dean had. When did that happen? Remus grumbled at no one. Probably some time ago, and Harry never wanted to mention it, Sirius muttered. That was a strange concept. James was distracted for a second to realize. It was such a common everyday thing, not something he would have thought about at all until he went a length of time without it happening. The worst tragedy yet, his resemblance to Prongs has only increased. Sirius burst out in near hysterics now. James longed to reach over and crack the idiot over the head, but was too grateful for his near-constant interruptions. He wouldn't live through this without them. Sirius was not convinced he'd read that right. Even as his heart gave an erratic thump of relief, his mouth remained open, but no more words came out to contradict him. The disbelief was having trouble settling in. Why did he? Lily could only start, but none of them had an answer for Draco's miraculous. They didn't even know what to call this. Was he truly being daft, and life under Voldemort's thumb had driven him stupid, or had he somehow grown immoral after all the things he'd done, and would in fact have been doing even more of in his time constantly surrounded by this life? Harry knew no more than them, but he hissed at Sirius to keep going no matter the answer, which they could all agree to. "We've never seen him begging to be in good graces again," James said with complete disgrace. "He stared at your face too long," Lily snipped, hands still shaking, mind flying in every direction of how Harry was going to get out of this one. Remus wanted to sneer at the comparison, but instead he was still more intrigued by Draco's reaction to this. Afraid of what? He should be in his element as much as his father, a bloodlust absent in his last years of attempted murders, because his own life was on the line, would now be able to flourish without fear. What was he missing? Harry made his own broken attempt at a giggle, some cobbled together thanks for Hermione she'd probably never hear for everything leading up to this moment, just buying them more time. "Maybe," Lily repeated aghast, clearly convinced Sirius was having her on. "Of all of them, I'd have thought Hermione, you said maybe." "Yeah," Sirius whispered softly. It made no sense to any of them. The last time they'd seen this kid, he'd only just been talked down by Dumbledore before the rest of that nightmare took place. He'd enjoyed the attention Dumbledore had praised upon him for nearly murdering half the kids in that school just to inadequately attempt one over on Dumbledore. Who was this lifeless kid? A boy Harry's age, who was no longer anywhere near the malicious child he'd once been. Finally, it seemed the world had caught up to one Malfoy who did not like the view, but more than that, had they discovered the way Harry had got free of this place. Bloody hell, can you even blame Ron for his insecurities at this rate? Sirius demanded of no one, eyes seeming permanently widened for so much going on. Even now they can't remember his name. Remus smacked him upside the head, all the reminder he needed to keep a move on. So long as all those kids were breathing, so could they. Harry had more than enough reasons to hate that woman, even as he watched one of her victims still spitting out her name in his own murderous voice. His fear only grew of her. It was going to get worse. It could always be worse. No, no, let's sit around and discuss this a few more hours. Sirius pleaded at nothing, never in his life believing he'd wish to remain in her presence a second longer. But if it kept the indecision alive and Voldemort wherever he was, he'd take it. "I'll brew the tea myself." Harry knew that they were just delaying the inevitable, that another fight to the death was flashing before their eyes, with another victim of her wand falling in front of Harry's eyes. Harry couldn't even offer to take the book to relinquish them of this, because something painful was building inside him, promising this to be true. "Merlin's pants. Whoever thought I'd be grateful for another Sunday dinner?" Sirius said, in a dazed sort of voice like he'd been hit over the head. This really did remind him of one to many dinner parties from his childhood. All the adults lording themselves over each other, admittedly, in an even more twisted way than he ever would have believed possible. And still, he'd take this mess over what they were fixing to invoke. "I'm glad they finally see our problem." Lily hadn't stopped shivering since all of this had started. The only thing she had left to draw comfort from was her son's still beating heart, but the loss it may have taken this day she could not begin to shake. Why would that catch her attention? Remus began in surprise, but just as quickly clipped his mouth shut. For one reason, it didn't matter. They were getting their wish and a reprieve that much longer from the imminent death. For another, the answer came sweeping back, that Death Eaters would think it would be in a vault in Gringotts. "That's the nicest spell she's probably ever thrown," Sirius promised, "and it's only so she can torture her victims later. You are not helping." James hissed, causing Sirius to flinch and wish he could keep his mouth shut and stop letting such errant thoughts go, but it was even harder to control when he only had to keep going. Sirius was on the cusp of reminding he'd gone toe-to-toe with her, and the lunatic had actually managed a hit. That should have told she did know what she was doing. but the brazen words died quickly on his tongue as his eyes flickered to Harry once more. He cared for nothing except his pup being out of there. The wanton murder surprised no one. But even after all this time, it still stung some part of them. Sirius likely hadn't even been a blip in her bloodthirsty quest. Lily cocked her head to the side, distracted for a moment from her own son to that of another's. How Narcissa still managed to stand up in defense for one thing, and this could very well be the reason for Draco's lackluster vengeance of his own. Had these two truly seen the errors of this way? Well, you did, Sirius got out through gritted teeth, imagining just for one glorious moment of bursting through the window and giving his pup the life-saving interruption he so needed once more. He wouldn't even care if it only again resulted in his death. He just wanted Harry out of there. Harry wondered if that hadn't been in his own mind. Surely his blood had been set on fire. In all of the talking, his mind had never ceased its panic tempo of trying to find a way out, and suddenly he was more desperate than ever for that to come true right this second. No. It was a plea, a beg, a denial, an outraged cry, and a desperately shouted scream all at once. There was no way in the world Sirius could keep going, to find out if this girl had managed to survive something a list of others had not. He couldn't do it, but then his shadowed grey eyes fell on Harry, doubled over as he clutched his skull, and screaming that again and again. Harry would kill himself trying to find out what had been done to his friend, and Sirius was getting his wish. He made sure his godson heard every word to stop it being his last. Sirius wished it wouldn't so loudly in here, but there was no other noise. Harry was still rocking in place, but listening so intently and hanging on every word. The fire seemed to have been silenced. He'd swear no one else was even breathing anymore. She was dead. If not from Bellatrix's insanity, then the worst werewolf to ever exist had ended her without a second thought. It was like a knife piercing his heart that he could never remove. She died in that place, and it was all his fault. It echoed back in his head now, along with everything he'd ever said against someone he couldn't live without. All the wasted weeks, all the times when he should have told her what a brilliant friend she was, the last thing he'd hear was her screaming. Sirius couldn't shout that, though he tried. The desperation he felt wanting to save this girl was as good as his godson, but he could only speak in the calm deadliness he knew before a fight to the death. James had already wrapped his arms painfully tight around Harry. No force on earth could have made his parents move from his side while he was in such a state, but the two still spared a moment to gaze at each other. James knew nothing could have stopped him screaming like a loon just as much as Ron was. How on earth? Remus began to rasp, but the absurd question died before he even realized he was asking it. The whys and hows could wait. All they needed to know was that Harry had another ally on his side now. Harry tried to collect himself, to keep a calm head like he had at the time, like Luna always managed no matter what. It seemed impossible for a second to wrench himself out of his memories and feel one of his very best friend's screams bleeding into his ears, but he kept struggling with all his might. He would not let them suffer through this while also worrying about him. Hermione, she was the one who needed his help. There were still questions in them, like what happened to Griffook in the first place. Even being hand-fed the events that had led Harry here, still, had them all reeling too much to try and imagine anyone else's fate. There was just no point in correcting Harry on that assumption, that a house like that was more likely to have wards against apparating altogether. It boiled down to the same thing. They'd have to use something more than magic to get out of this, something the Malfoys would never see coming. It was a ghost, a trick of the light. Dumbledore was really back from the dead and trapped in that mirror, or a moment of insanity on Harry's part. It didn't matter. Sirius burned through the moment, unconvinced it would do Harry any more good now than its original purpose when it had been forgotten as glittering grit. "Oh boy," James whispered. "The goblin that started the lie," Sirius swallowed painfully. "If he did it once, he'll do it again," Remus tried to say with confidence, but already he could feel the worrying nags picking this apart. The goblin would rather save himself and tell the truth, getting a pass from his own bout of torture. "By Godric's word, they actually sent him," Lily whispered, near delirium with happiness for this turn of events. "Either you'll overpower that idiot, or he's going to help." James shook Harry's shoulder, as if trying to will him to remember it this way. Remus meant to scoff. How could they take that threat for anything? The closest he'd ever come to killing was a hippogriff, and he hadn't even managed to work the strings of that. All of those attempts last year had led to nothing by more inept plans. He'd had a chance to turn over Harry and his friends. Surely Harry was about to do what the marauders had never been capable of, turn their once enemy into an ally. Sirius swore the unhealthy beating of his heart through all of this came to a stuttering stop when nothing happened. They'd complied. Panic had seized hold of them once more, and who knew what was going to happen next because of it? Harry bowed his head in shame, but his parents wouldn't have that. James put his arm around him once more, the only thought they had left to bear through with him no matter how bad it got. Well, I didn't see that. Harry would have fallen out of his seat if James hadn't caught him, eyes pure white for a moment as they rolled back into his head, until a wild cry burst out and he came back to himself. Sirius tried to convince himself it was just overexcitement. A house elf would save the day again. He could go back and kick himself for never paying those things any mind later. Possibly where he bloody slept, Remus whispered. Priorities, Lily agreed. Harry didn't hear her. He could hardly make out anything except the bright, fiery pain from the war inside him. It was Hermione in danger. He had to save her. What else should matter right now? You managed to surround yourself with the best people in the world, James said solemnly, imagining any number of others would be tackling that elf and begging to be out of here, rather than these wandless teenagers trying to stand their ground and help however they could. I am corrected, Lily told Harry, trying desperately to keep that from happening again in a different way. Those are far better priorities than you've shown in months, apparently. Harry couldn't have responded if he'd wanted to, a feeling never far from him in that time now coming back full force as he heard his own promise breaking around him. Someone would not be making it to Bill and Floors alive. Not him. Sirius was incapable of saying that old nickname intelligibly, let alone the further onslaught of horrors he'd unleash by once again being in Harry's presence, the constant reminder everything stemmed back to this being his fault. Harry had tears in his eyes now. Every breath he drew seemed to pain him. No matter how badly it hurt, at least Sirius could tell himself he knew where this traitor's life was at. Harry didn't have that same luxury. Without being able to look at the others, every word an effort now to keep going, he marshaled through whatever was left. It really couldn't get worse than he'd already done. James was a breath away from flying into a rampage, his arms now constricting Harry, the only thing holding him in place. That rat was the reason Harry had been in arm's reach for Vernon to do the same to his son. Now here he was delivering the same. He couldn't even mourn the loss of such a once trusted friend, because this twisted nightmare version kept drawing the knife back for another strike. In vain for his brain to latch onto anything else in the world, Remus couldn't help but admire Ronald in that second. He'd heard him speak, what, almost 4 years ago before this day, and could manage such a thing. It didn't at all help what he was hearing now. Prongs hated himself for trusting him to begin with, for allowing himself to be the victim of this betrayal, for the very smallest part of his soul still holding out hope that would finally get through to his friend, and he'd do one last thing he could still believe and let his son go without being forced to. Then it was impossible to know anything else but the punch to his heart that caused a sob to break out of his rattling chest. It had taken 16 long years, twice the amount of time they'd ever even known each other. If their friendship had faded away in that time from his mind, James would have insisted he wasn't even surprised anymore. But finally, in the one most desperate moment where Harry, his son, had needed him most, Uncle Wormy came through. Sirius was getting worried about James. He sounded damn near delirious over there. He didn't know what to do for his best mate, though. Would he really tear away Prongs, seeing him having a moment of weakness as a good thing? That's all this traitor had ever been to their future, one moment of weakness after another that had landed them in this hellish life cycle of praying for Harry to get out of everything on his own. He couldn't even look at him right now any more than the blurry text before him he was still cobbling together. Sirius froze for about 10 seconds, his active mind spinning out the reason for this and the following scenario in that time. There was a deep, malicious colored tint to it all, and then he brushed right past it without caring. He'd worm his way out of this one just like he did everything without looking back. And then he wasn't. He was not doing everything in his power to get away. He didn't understand. Sirius couldn't cry. The burn was nearly overpowering. He He couldn't breathe past it, but his mind remained frozen on that one stubbornly present idea. If he cried, that meant he cared. He didn't realize the book had left his hands, didn't seem aware of anything left as Lily coughed for a few moments to clear herself, wiped the snot away from her nose, and let the tears fall as she dragged out the rest. That couldn't just be it. Remus didn't know what he was expecting. Some long drawn-out speech begging for forgiveness, to go out in a blaze of glory like James and Sirius. He was unworthy of any of that, but this last despicable act done to him, instead of by him, was not sitting right. All James saw was the most fitting end he could have ever bestowed upon Peter. He had died protecting Harry. It was the last thing he ever could have asked of him. The worst part for Lily was how it didn't even faze her 17-year-old son. Her boys were fighting harder than ever not to go to pieces to show the same. But Harry had already been through more in his short years of life than even they had, and still this pain of having this traitor in his life before he'd thrown it all away was one he'd been spared from having to feel in his need to save his friend. At least she could still be grateful for that. Harry longed to comfort his family like they'd done for him so many times now, but the truth was he didn't have much to say for the man who'd given his family up to Voldemort. It was Hermione who still held his every attention. It was her Harry only had eyes for, as his mother kept sniffling, but reading for his sole benefit. Harry twitched uncomfortably at feeling anything the same as Bellatrix right now. That woman had single-handedly done more to his life, almost in equal to Wormtail. First Sirius, now Hermione, his heart clenched painfully in his chest as he gripped his wand tight enough to break it all over again for whatever else she was to do. I bloody wish they were. Lily sighed just for something to say, but her boys were starting to scare her with those haunted, skeletal expressions. She just had to finish this. Surely they'd make some sense of it all. There was no doubt in their mind that she'd do it. It was not a happy thought by any means, but at least one solid fact they could all cling to, something else to trade their rage on that wasn't a complete mess of other feelings mixed in. No, James' voice still sounded like a garbled mess, but his eyes were on his son again. No matter how many visions swept through them, he could still see that. Fear for the situation only doubled inside of Harry now. He watched the marauders still trying to shake away their shock of what they'd just heard. He felt like relief should have been imminent for whatever act had just caused that chandelier to save them. But he could only wrap his arm tighter around his chest for the pain's increase. Sirius laughed. It sounded like he was dying while doing it, but the emotion burst out of him without his control. He remembered how much he'd hated that house, Elf when it had come into Harry's life. Then the convincing little bugger had slowly warmed him to what he'd been overlooking of the whole species. Now Darby, the free house. Elf was going to save his godson's life and get him out of that place once and for all. Darby being there should make it no problem at all, Lily whispered, trying to infuse just one note of good into this disaster. Elves could apparate before they could walk with their born magical abilities. There was a lurching sensation through Harry's heart, and for just a second he tried to convince himself it was all relief. They'd gotten away free. Then it happened again. Shutters fell across Harry's eyes. They saw in the brief second before he buried his face into his dad's chest that there was no second guessing any magical means had been used to circumvent this. They'd both lost a friend this night, one who had done everything in the world to help though he'd had no reason to, and the other who finally had to let go. Lily had not stopped crying for the past hour, it seemed, nor did she now as the tears mingled with these final words from a beloved one. Chapter 24, The Wandmaker. Chapter text, Harry hadn't even realized his mother had stopped, because it never seemed to stop. From as far back as he could remember, twice now, death had followed in his shadow no matter who it was and how much he cared about them. He didn't want to leave the safe cocoon of his father's arms, a blessing he'd never been given before here, for he knew when he left it would only continue. Unlike the first time he'd lived through this, though, he had to keep going without much of a choice. Oh, he could walk away, live in ignorance of what he'd left behind, but not any more. Hermione, Ron, Ginny, there were still those who deserved to be remembered in whatever fault his hand had been in their death next. His dad seemed even more reluctant to let go than Harry. Looking at his grave face, A part of Harry wished he'd never learned anything about what Pettigrew had done to him, that his father could have been spared this knowledge for everything it was doing to him, or at the very least, he hadn't a hand in it, been witness, so that some part of his dad could have thought one day Wormtail would turn his life around before it was too late. Now he couldn't even have that. He should be the one to suggest a break. He needed one as much as anyone. But as surprising as it was heartening, his mother handed him the book, warm hands lingering over his for only a few moments before squeezing them and giving him a push to keep going. "It's all right, pup," Sirius promised when he looked at all of them. "Hermione's worth it," Remus whispered. His dad still had a hand tight around Harry's shoulder and gave him a clumsy pat to transfer the same, so Harry kept going. Harry could finally breathe. He wanted to see her with his own eyes, hug her and never stop apologizing for his slip that had got them all caught in the first place. But Darby still needed him, and he trusted Bill and Ron to look after her right now. He still had time left with her. "It's an old fail-proof way to block him out, though I wish you'd find a better method," Sirius murmured quietly, the burn of regret in him more present than ever for Harry having to experience this. James had no idea what that was like. The most muggle thing he'd ever done was traipse up flights of stairs for school each year, certainly throw a punch or two, but he wanted to. For Harry, to understand what his son meant, he would have jumped in without question to help. "You can't grieve without love," Remus tried to tell himself in a despicable voice, knowing he should hate how much he was grieving for both deaths on that night. Lily was grateful for it, her level-headed son still managing to shine through it all. She needed that light, the hope now more than ever. Sirius wished someone would slap him awake from this nightmare, but then he just kept watching Harry read with that calm, steady pace, every muscle in him now feeling what he had then, and he still couldn't resent living through it all for anything. "Well, yes," Remus strived to keep up, and not get lost back in his own memories. He couldn't recall exactly what had been said between Grindelwald and Voldemort. He'd been a little more involved in everything else. But essentially, he was sure Voldemort still did not know what had been stolen from Gregorovitch, and the man Dumbledore had once befriended died with that knowledge. The one death that meant nothing to them, but arguably the most important, and was felt the least. Lily's cheek was still wet as she brushed at it. The reveal from that moment, only days ago for them, had dimmed somewhat to her in light of what her friend had done to their future. She knew it was still as fresh and raw to the Marauders, though, as when it had first sunk in. Time had not passed enough to even be able to move on with that acceptance, let alone adding on now to such a death. James had to clear his throat a few times, but finally managed to get out coherently. "Well, he's managed to be parted from her side, so I'm confident she's already well enough to be sick of him again." Harry wondered if he was supposed to laugh or not. Even the idea of it felt too forced, though, so he could only internally appreciate what his dad was trying to do, but he couldn't look away from his own memories like the Marauders were now forcing themselves to. Sirius hadn't even the presence of mind to be curious about that, and now that he was trying to, he'd already worked it out for himself. Hard work, he understood. Doing things the Muggle way could have its own rewards, and Darby was the kind who deserved the unconventional both. That about set them all crying all over again. James didn't care how he had to do it. His first available chance, he was going over to the Malfoys and rescuing this elf with as many socks as he could possess. "I think this is better," Lily promised, nails digging into his shoulder to stop her voice from breaking again. "Dumbledore may even be envious of this." The last image had not left his mind, but sat floating there just behind the printed words. The ocean on one side, the sky climbing to infinite. It really had been perfect. Harry continued to sit there for a few seconds. It was as if he didn't want to let the image go. When he did finally keep going, there was a new tone to his voice. There was a sense there again they felt they'd been missing for so long. They hadn't even realized it had left until now. Harry felt the sudden need to get on bended knee and thank the heavens for the timing of all this. If something had happened to Ginny as well. He'd already caused so much misery tonight. "And I always thought Marley was the optimist of the family," Remus muttered. All five of them flinched, the reminder to shop for their own knife hovering above them. Bill wasn't the only one, but Harry knew he was going to have to explain himself and was not up for doing it twice. His scar may not have been fizzling on his forehead now, but the decision he'd made still felt paramount. James had to clear his throat again, but at least now he only sounded like he had a bad head cold. Harry, he began tentatively. I know he's not, Harry assured without looking up, but I know what I saw. There really was no explanation any of them could fathom from this, and Harry was reluctant at best to share anything right now. They gave him space and let him be for now. They were only just now drawing themselves out of their own. I say a man can know too much and still never be right, Remus sighed. Work out what? Lily finally asked, all of them starting to grasp they'd missed something. Harry hesitated for a second, considering answering now, but again well aware he'd be sharing these new concepts with Ron and Hermione, and didn't want to have the same argument twice. James watched Harry intently now as he tried to piece together what his son didn't think they'd like to hear. There was only one place that came to mind, and it made him grow even more cold than the preceding hour of where Voldemort now was. Man has a hell of a lot of patience, Sirius snorted. I never could have gone that long without asking the same. Wow, Lily whispered, finding it extremely hard to imagine Ron telling his eldest brother that. Oh, but you can dump half of the insanity on them, Remus scowled lightly. Just imagine for a second, Harry, you walked in on that. Dumbledore or no, you never would have let that go. Harry met his eyes for a moment, and then admitted a bit of shame in agreeing. He'd never really thought of it like that, but he had been rather privileged in always knowing what was going on above others, and his resolve to wait on telling them crumbled by the second. All right, I give up. James threw his hands in the air in exasperation. What the hell are you on about? Harry sighed, but gave in. He should have known he'd never really be able to hide anything from them. When he was done, he braced himself for the barrage of anger he knew they so often felt at Dumbledore, and him following those decisions. But to his surprise, his dad spoke first. Dumbledore really did do something right by you. He sounded half amused, half exasperated. Harry chose his next words carefully. You lot weren't opposed of me going after the Hallows, so why are you agreeing now? Because you never could have done what was really needed to do this, Harry, and that's okay, Lily said. Harry wasn't so sure, but then the conviction in the answer from his past wasn't dimming at all, so he didn't argue the point. He'd still have expected more shock and anger from them all, but they just looked as tired as him. The true answer of where Harry expected the last Hallow to be was only another in a long string of unbelievable circumstances surrounding this life. They followed his lead and let him solidify his suspicions about the Horcrux first. Did they really think he could leave them behind? Sirius chuckled. Were they really going to let him? Remus snorted. We're never again allowed to tell Hermione she can't perform under pressure, James nodded solemnly. Turning something she heard a goblin say months ago back around now. You've really got to admire that girl's gumption, Lily beamed. That doesn't surprise me, Remus muttered, sensing a problem there before the trio left the goblin to his own again, but more than happy to let him keep it safe for now considering what he'd done. Was he? Sirius asked in surprise, trying to remember all the way back to an actual pleasant memory of Harry first going there. Harry's really got the hat on meeting the most interesting people, Remus shrugged. Harry's posture didn't really change, but he held his chin a little straighter, and there was a more challenging hint in his tone now. He knew he didn't have to defend his actions, but he was prepared to. Oh, we've long since learned that, James agreed with pure fondness. Couldn't love him more for it, Lily chuckled. I really don't think that's it, Remus disagreed. More he's trying to understand why. Sad really on his part, Sirius sniffed. I think that's more sad on our part, Lily sighed, that he'd even question it at all. It really just shows how bad relations between our species is. Well, he shouldn't judge the lot of us, Sirius still shrugged. Do all goblins belabor the obvious, or is it just this one? Sirius asked. They're all rather direct, Remus agreed. Sirius was 13 years old again, and he was already having the worst day of his summer. His parents had refused him a visit to James, because they were to go to Diagon Alley and get Regulus, new school things, with all the posturing and presenting this came along with. They perchance ran into his cousins the Lestranges at Gringotts, and one too many snide comments from their eldest son had already worn his parents' nerves that day. He'd been delegated to their care, and the results had left him scarred for life. He hadn't gone near that bank since. Now here was his godson, proposing a living nightmare to him. Sirius held his breath for a few seconds before letting it out slowly and waving them all away from his grey pallor. That was already a long time ago, and he'd suffered worse things far more recently. Harry was admittedly surprised. Sirius was the most vivid reaction. Lily and James had just exchanged a now common look before shifting protectively next to their son, and Remus just seemed resigned, as if nothing could surprise him anymore. That's fair, Remus sighed. I'd think the same if I wasn't so used to your insanity by now. Thanks, Harry told him blandly. I'm afraid I'm still with the goblin on this one, Remus winced. Assuming you're right, Harry, I can't even begin to imagine how that one's going to go down. Harry rubbed at his scar again, which wasn't a very good omen, as he couldn't really answer. Is that all it's been? Lily said, with a touch of nostalgia. The evening her son had arrived here was most assuredly the most memorable of her life. The ensuing time of watching him transform from that timid 11-year-old to the man he was now, and yet it was never enough. There were still whole gaps, days and weeks of his life they'd missed out on, and she'd still never get enough of. I'm a touch astounded he instantly knew which one you were talking about, James admitted. He was the one who emptied it, Remus reminded. I can see how it would stick out to him. Harry watched the four around him shift awkwardly. It was not a concept he'd ever been privy to. He'd certainly never had reason to think about it, as he'd never had a problem with any other race of creature that existed. However, he thought back to what little he had seen of wizards' views on others regarding Hagrid and Lupin, and was now seeing through a goblin and those around him the problem was even more widespread with those that were in everyday wizarding society. Oh, here we go. Sirius gave an exaggerated sigh. This is an age-old argument that has no bloody end in sight. I can't even imagine there is a resolution to such a thing, Remus agreed sadly. Those are secrets guarded within the species. To share them with the other, honestly, it wouldn't ever do much good, as there's only the slim hope of recreating them in an equal light. The hostility doesn't help, Lily sighed. Some try, Remus said quietly as he held his own wand. Since he'd gotten it, he'd never been able to forget how precious it was for someone like him. I think Spew has finally been validated beyond all reason to her, James said sadly. It can only do good at this rate. Can't make it worse, Sirius grudgingly agreed. Harry said that so quietly, it was as if he were hoping no one had heard him. He could hear Hermione, clear as if she were talking into his ear now, saying that slur with strength, a bite that promised she wouldn't let it define her, but that didn't mean he was going to start going around calling her that any more than he would his mother. And here I thought they just didn't like to socialize with us, Sirius muttered. You haven't even asked him what all was in there, Remus cautioned. You're risking a lot for being unsure if there's another Horcrux like you're hoping. We'll work out details if he even agrees, Harry said with actual confidence again. Rude, Lily couldn't help but mutter. He was a guest in their home, surely he knew that. Remus watched Harry wearily. He was worried he had no idea what he was getting into. Harry didn't seem to notice, and was continuing to rub his scar with increasing frequency, and he decided to wait until the memory plaguing him had passed. She could also just be a greedy hoarder who flipped out at the idea of you going in there, Sirius pointed out. You know who entrusted the diary to the Malfoys, Harry reminded. He did that as a way to keep his legacy with Slytherin alive. I think he would have given one to another trusted Death Eater in that same way, to connect himself to Gringotts like he thinks he should have been. It was a lot to risk on a guess, but they had no better ideas. That's very likely, Lily did agree with him there. I'm confident the only one who ever knew of these Horcruxes was Slughorn. That's the easy part to understand, Sirius whispered. So you now have a free pass to disturb him the rest of your life. What a trade, James muttered with a pained expression. He wanted to praise his son for this feat. Ollivander had never done anything to deserve what had been done to him, but the sardonic statement was the best he could manage while his mind was still filled with so much else. Harry didn't need to look up to see the sympathetic, but completely devoid of hope expressions around him. They were already inside him. He knew what he was asking, but the wand residing on him now meant there must be an answer out there. James almost let a flash of madness take him as he went to grab that wand away and break it in half, burn it before so many awful things could be done. But then he really looked at Sirius and took a deep breath to calm himself. Harry felt more than saw them all collectively hold their wands tight to them, somehow even more uncomfortable with this idea than the allegations of Griffith before. Not one of them had been able to blame Harry for his loss in confidence when his own wand had been taken away from him. It was something that could be replaced, but would never be the same. The madness of wand makers, really. Sirius chuckled uneasily. He'd never sat around and asked one once he'd gotten his. You were using Hermione's safely just fine. It doesn't mean it's going to feel like your own, Lily sighed. Remus at least got an enjoyable moment of realizing so many of Voldemort's Death Eaters were at least now out of wands, especially Bellatrix, all in one night with no foreseeable way to get any more what with two renowned names out of their reach. So, should Ron have been using the Blackthorn one this whole time? Sirius asked. I think that's what he's saying, James agreed. I still don't think it would ever be as good as the one he got when he was 13, though. It would just work slightly better for him than Harry. So what he's really saying is Harry should have just wrestled one out of someone's hand and problem mostly solved, Sirius snorted. You're incorrigible, Lily sighed, fighting back the vivid idea of Sirius running around and boxing wizards he didn't like to collect wands now. In their jokes, they'd almost forgotten Ron and Hermione's wand had been taken as well as the Blackthorn one. This was all the kids had left. Now the trio were running on fumes to keep up, and having to rely on these pitiful replacements that would forever carry around reminders of their past. That's never stopped Harry, James pointed out for no one in here. Lily wrung her hands painfully for a moment, wishing she could scold Harry about letting that poor man rest after all he'd been through, but really there was no proper time to have this conversation. We stopped asking ourselves that a long time ago, Remus sighed. And he was the only one to ask, Sirius pouted. Looks like we'll just have to live on the knowledge Harry's beyond us all. Harry flushed, finally putting a bit of color back in his face before anyone as he kept reading with determination. There was another answer and he'd get it. But why would they? Lily asked in surprise. They've no real reason to do such a thing. There's a price out on my wand, as much as me, Harry reminded. They will. They'll want to know why they didn't have mine to confiscate. Harry did wince with guilt. He truly had not meant to make Hermione feel any worse, but the circumstances hadn't allowed him much tact. Well, Voldemort already has that anyways, James reminded dangerously. He certainly wouldn't rest until that monster was ashes under his heel. The man loves his job, Sirius snorted. Did she really think they were speaking hypothetically this whole time? Remus asked more kindly than mocking, though. She had just come through an ordeal, and it wouldn't be surprising if even her sharp mind was struggling to keep up. They barely were, and Harry had already explained it to them. James would swear the same chill a Dementor would cause had just settled over them all. Even with his son having said it, even supporting his son in choosing not to stop this, what was happening before them was practically unbearable to hear. I can't imagine he'd take much interest in the other two, Lily reminded. The wand would be his favorite to study of the three anyways. Never hurts to ask, Remus shrugged. That poor man, Lily whispered one more time. He would surely not be Voldemort's first or last victim, but what he'd endured deserved no less attention. None of them could hold against him whatever he'd done. Honestly, everyone but Bill is used to Harry doing this by now anyways, Sirius reminded, starting to shift restlessly again. Life was really starting to spark back inside of him. None of them could let themselves dwell on what had happened to Peter any more than him, or Harry for Darby. They had to keep thinking of what else was in store. And Grindelwald survived. James emphasized this for himself really, literally defeating him without killing him, and using the wand just fine, throwing out whatever credibility it is to be calling it the unbeatable wand. Maybe it's not the one of legend, Grindelwald just boasted it was, Sirius reminded. He and Gregorovitch just had a really powerful one, and Dumbledore was still better. This whole mess has always been wrapped up in Voldemort's delusions, Remus sighed. Harry shivered, fighting off his vision blurring out of sight in both remembered pain and the thrills of what-ifs. He did not understand. He'd made the right choice, but then there was still a part of him questioning this decision and where that wand was now. Clearly Ron hasn't been keeping up, Lily snorted. The marauders looked murderous by now of this foul serpent's declaration. They valued their old school as their home, a sanctuary away from the war, a womb of sorts where they'd grown into who they really were and would change nothing of it. For Voldemort to be there, desecrating what the headmaster had ensured for them and countless generations by his mere presence, had them each ready to end this war this second if he didn't get the hell off their school grounds. Harry hadn't realized he'd started to crumple the page up in his hand as he finished. He smoothed it out now, eyes still swimming with more unshed tears. All he'd ever wished was to understand, and still with the decision in him to accept he'd never fully get that, it only left more worry to come. Chapter 25, Shell Carted. Chapter text: I regret nothing for what you're about to read as James' following thoughts in this chapter's opening. We have no canon answer, but I can't help but love the entire Marauders and exploring every aspect of them. That is all. HP Remus had to admire Harry's perseverance as he tried to hand him the book. The shadow had not been there when he'd first awoken, and still he fought his way to get to the end and see what came next. Remus took the book without question, some part of him almost jealous at his ability to keep looking ahead when he'd never been able to shake his past, and how it would infect everything around him. He was extremely relieved when James cleared his throat again, this time with purpose, and said, "How about we take a break, eh? If you lot are really going to be breaking into Gringotts soon, I need a breather." The others agreed at once, Lily immediately dragging Harry off to the kitchen again to help with dinner. James slumped off to his infant's room in relief it had been so easy. He needed a moment alone. They'd started all of this believing all of James' friends had died for the little babe in his arms to have been raised by such despicable people. It had been heartbreaking, but made total sense, as there was no doubt in their minds his friends now loved this baby. Enough they'd started referring to themselves as his uncles before James even had. They'd slowly learned the reason why each had failed him. Hell, they'd already thought Peter had died once already involving this mess, only to find out he'd been the cause of half their life's end. Now he had a chance to do something about this before it all really happened. Had it been enough? Should Peter's moment that had doomed him be enough for James' forgiveness? He hadn't thought twice about all Sirius had done, going after revenge rather than his son. What about Remus? He'd made it abundantly clear. He had a fear of being around children that wasn't likely to ever go away. If it wasn't for James being around, he likely would alienate himself from the rest of the world all over again and never think twice about it again. And still James hoped for a better future for him regardless. Peter's betrayal wasn't even just centered around him. Even if he could ever look his old friend in the face again, knowing what he'd done to Lily and Harry, there were others. He'd been ratting out the order for some time before the Potter's downfall. Could James just sweep that under the rug because of the reason he'd died? James didn't even have to ask the other two. He had known, from the moment he'd seen their faces, they would never forgive and forget this. James still couldn't either, but could he still make an effort to have his friend in his life knowing all this? Was there anything he could still stomach to cling to his old life and try to save the best aspects of Wormtail? Prongs. He'd been so lost in thought, he hadn't heard their approach until they were right beside him, and he slowly looked up, quite glad his eyes weren't red-rimmed this time at least. Lily's got lunch ready. Remus still sounded far too much like someone visiting the deathly ill, so James knew he wasn't hiding his thoughts as much as he'd been hoping. Great, yeah, he quickly agreed, getting up from the chair and still keeping his infant cradled protectively in his arms. He'd fallen back off to sleep after getting his nappy changed. James hated to rouse him again, but he did need a bottle. He stopped for a second in following them out and grabbed the cloak on the way down. Harry was, for once, the most lively of them all during this meal. They all indulged his every whim in change of topic, but James was grateful he wasn't the only one hardly picking at whatever was in front of him. In Sirius' case, it was more unease for what was to come than letting himself linger in his past. He actually wanted nothing in his stomach for what Harry was planning on doing if he was going to get through it without hurling from stress. It was also him who chose to delay this as long as he could as they all stood up from the table, and Sirius snatched the invisibility cloak into his own hands. I'm guessing Prongs here has decided to regress a bit. Sorry, Evans. Potter, the three corrected at once, while Sirius' smirk turned pompous at effectively now having all attention and continuing without interruption, and has decided to try an old but tested and true theory of cursing away his problems. So he swung the cloak over his shoulders like a traveling one instead of its real use, leaving his head and most of his torso exposed, and seeming more like a poorly placed disillusionment charm was now about him. Hit me prongs. You're not even going to make it a challenge for him, Remus asked in mock disappointment as he accepted the infant without a second thought. Where's your spirit, Padfoot? I knew there was a reason we keep you around Mooney. Sirius' smirk widened as he did pull the rest of it over himself before that too vanished. I say we let him keep sneaking out the back door. Lily rolled her eyes. She waved her wand and sent the dishes to the sink. It's the quietest this house will ever be. I resemble that. Sirius' very disappointed voice now came from right beside the back door, causing Harry to try his hardest to cover a snort of laughter. In the same second, James flicked his wand towards the ceiling, but the silent spell he'd cast did nothing to the room except make the baby giggle anew at the unexpected flash of light. Furrowing his brow, James now aimed his wand carefully at a spot 3 inches from behind Lily and said, "Accio invisibility cloak," and still remained empty-handed. Looking very intrigued now, he jabbed his wand with purpose, and the chair he was aiming at was knocked over completely silently, but Sirius' voice appeared behind him instead. "I'm hurt prongs. It's like you're not even trying." "All 3 of those should have worked, and you know it," James insisted around a laugh. "Care to have a go then, as clearly you're not up to this?" Sirius offered, revealing himself by offering his mate the cloak. "You'll do anything to get out of what Harry's getting up to next," James chuckled, half in concern as he took it and ran his hand along the object he'd never really thought twice about in his youth. What were its true capabilities? Could it really cloak one from death, even the spell? Of course they could not test such a thing on each other, but if he'd had it that Halloween night, if Lily and Harry had hid under this instead of it being in Dumbledore's possession, come on, Sirius. Harry couldn't help a slightly twisted smile. "I either didn't do it, or I survived. That's all that matters, right?" "That's just cruel, Harry," Sirius sighed. "I'd rather prongs try to transfigure me into a cat all day, but I suppose we'll have to get this over with eventually." James felt wrenched from his thoughts and quickly put up a believable smile that he was paying attention. He carefully folded the cloak back away and tucked it into his robes for now. Remus was laughing as he went back up the stairs to put the infant down, and it was only once he'd been settled back in the crib and all the enchantments put back around his room specifically did he realize he'd had the little cub nestled in his arms this entire time. No scream, no fuss, not even a real acknowledgement it was so commonplace. "It's as close as you'll ever get," he forcefully reminded himself, gritting his teeth as he left, but still there was a pang in his soul he couldn't truly leave behind as he joined them, grabbing the book and beginning once more. Then he should have just bloody told you about it. Sirius was likely never going to let that go. Sheer dumb luck. James sighed with no idea of a real alternative. "He's got you there, Harry, even if you didn't take it for yourself. You bloody well could have tried to take it and then break it or something to stop this," Remus frowned. "As if I could have resisted the temptation by then," Harry disagreed. "Besides, if the track record follows, it may actually be easier to defeat him with this wand's trace of bad luck." "Yeah, Harry, you keep living that dream," Sirius sighed, half his mind now on going to Dumbledore and taking this away from him with or without murder before it became a problem again. "It's natural to second-guess yourself," Lily promised. "Even more so for you," James said with a slight grin, "this being your first time to not react and all." Harry managed a laugh for the two that was still restricted by his mind, no more satisfied with an answer on the current horizon. "I swear those two will never agree on anything," Remus snorted. They'd all been feeling that for days, and the struggle for an answer wasn't growing less with time, but their acceptance they may never get one was being more forcibly put into their life. "Some people like having witnesses to their flirting. Oh, hello, prongs." Sirius Mark waved cheerfully at him, who smirked without repentance. "Merlin, Harry, you really don't want to pick a side between them," Sirius snickered without much feeling. "I can't even begin to imagine what it was, though," Lily sighed. "Agreed," Sirius nodded. "He did used to live there," Remus offered some flimsy excuse. "Maybe he's still tied to the house, could sense Harry's presence there. I might believe that if he hadn't been given clothes," James disagreed. "Surely that breaks whatever magic binds the elf to the house. It can't just be symbolic." That's bloody ridiculous, Prongs, Sirius snorted. And what's your idea? He challenged. You think Darby just likes to pop in there for nostalgia? You lot are impossible, Lily sighed, rather than letting them keep going as she waved Remus on. Besides, Remus agreed with that, his ghost would have surely been mentioned by now, and his eye wouldn't be blue anymore, just translucent. He could have gone on to be the best-dressed ghost ever, though. He and Nick could have started their own club, James giggled. Are his legs still healing? Lily asked, not understanding the ire. No, he could walk pretty well on his own now, Harry shrugged, thinking it more likely Griffook really had just been getting on Fleur's nerves. Sirius visibly gulped, but put up a believable enough expression of excitement. They'd be getting confirmation one way or another a Horcrux was in there, one that surely would still be there in their time. I'd be more suspicious if he did do it out of the goodness of his heart, James said fairly. He has as much stakes in this as Lily began in defense. He doesn't know why they want in there, James reminded. He just believes Harry's not doing it for personal gain, but he doesn't know they're doing it to take down Voldemort. Sorry, Lily Flower, this goblin really has no reason to do this but personal gain of something. He finished with an uneasy frown for what he suspected that was. Lily stopped arguing the point, displeased he was right. They all sighed without surprise now, though Sirius still tried to reason with nothing. Couldn't you offer him Slytherin's locket instead? Maybe we'll get lucky, and that was goblin-made too. Or you could just explain to him carrying that sword around is easier than fetching more basilisk fangs. I'm sure he'll understand. Remus rolled his eyes. You're not helping, Moony, James sighed. I'm not really trying, he agreed. This goblin was going to make a play at that sword as soon as he had his hands on it. Harry's not talking himself out of this one. I like to think it would appear to anyone showing a sense of bravery and need, Lily chuckled. If you were a Hufflepuff down in that chamber, I doubt it would have magically not been drawn to you for wearing the wrong scarf. The real question is, would it appear to any wizard or anyone? Remus stressed, mind on himself mostly. Would the great founders of the school have allowed creatures in attendance? Would the sword come for a werewolf? More like ignorance, James said fairly. I really can't say there's too many people who have extensively looked into this. I know I haven't. Even then, it happened so long ago, we're beyond getting an answer now, unless someone invented a really good time-turner, Sirius snorted. Even a goblin betraying his race by helping to break into the place. Sirius couldn't help but snip. He's going pretty high and mighty, having declared himself a traitor to his kind only days ago, just agreeing to consider this. You win some, you lose some, James offered. Clearly he's hoping winning this back will absolve him of how he'd gotten it. Then he's no better than anyone else in history, trying to only pretend the good of what they did existed, Lily huffed. The victors write history, Lily agreed with a hint of bitterness. It was playing out before Harry's eyes now. If this future progressed much farther, children would grow up thinking Muggleborns truly had stolen magic for themselves, and there would be no one left to speak the truth. This really isn't a matter that should be boiled down to who's worse, Remus sighed. Harry needs it more for a greater purpose, but if he did hand it over willingly now, it would make history as a turning point in this war, mutually putting all the goblins against Voldemort if word got out he'd done this, and that could be even more beneficial. Harry watched them debating this with a fond smile. No matter what the outcome was, he'd never grow tired of seeing them talk about all this. It could only help them. That would never work, Sirius said at once. He'd know the fake faster than you could get your hands on it, as if he'd ever takes eyes off you long enough anyways. Quick, go put Luna in mortal peril. Surely something of Ravenclaw's will appear to her. James snickered. Lily clucked her tongue and looked sadly at her boy. He was living proof of what history could do to a person. Couldn't he realize all the mess that had got this started between the houses couldn't just be another exaggerated story? And that's all that matters. James snorted. Harry tried not to feel too insulted by all the stunned faces or their very impressed mutters. What a good idea that was. Should that be our meter going forward on how I should feel about these plans? Lily giggled. If you three ever agree it's a good idea, then I'll know something's really wrong. That's a fault on his own part, James snorted. Your backup's just as important in a caper like this. Please stop giving others your insane advice, Lily sighed. Well, I'm out, Sirius announced, getting up to do just that. No, you're not, Remus told him without looking up, grabbing his pants leg and pulling him right back down, keeping him there by throwing an arm around him and trying to keep going despite serious protests. Come on, Padfoot, James wheedled. Think of it like revenge. You're finally going to get to hear of this place being bested. Yeah, I really want to hear how it's all going to go worse with Harry there, Sirius groaned. Gee, thanks, Harry huffed. Sirius shivered and muttered again with a longing look towards the door, but he'd been mostly joking before anyways. He really had lived through much worse in these past 2 weeks than that memory could hold over him again. I'm surprised you didn't just talk the dragon to sleep, Lily kindly poked fun and kept his attention. Hard to do in between the screaming fits, he muttered absently. Actually, I'm more surprised than anything the goblin with you had gone along with it, Harry said. Griffook sure didn't make it seem like we just get left down there and mender around. Bellatrix was already deep into her joyous threats and torturous phase. Sirius shifted uneasily as he dredged up details. Her parents only encouraged this. I'm not sure whose idea it was. I don't even know if they did it to prove a point or for a laugh because I wouldn't behave that day. But I'm sure it was a combination of bribes and threats the goblin went along with it. If they'd come back and found me hiding in one of the vaults instead of a niche, they'd have probably left me there permanently and claimed I'd done it all myself if anyone asked, not that anyone would have ouch. He gave Remus half a glare and half a warm smile as he finished. Okay, when my friends would have. Good Padfoot, Remus mockingly cooed. I'd be more worried about this plan if you did cobble it together within the hour, James agreed. What was it again? He asked Harry. Harry furrowed his brow in thought for a moment, before shaking his head. They didn't need to ask more, he'd tell when he remembered fully. Even if this didn't involve his kid brother, I'm sure he wouldn't be happy about this, James agreed. He did work for Gringotts after all, and likely felt at least a little defensive of his workplace. Remus shifted uneasily in particular for having been the one to say all that, well aware such descriptions could be placed on more species than just goblins. Well, that's nice, Sirius made a gallant effort to say with a straight face, before he caved anyways and snorted with laughter. No one really ever explained to her the girl wasn't in danger. James chuckled. Considering Cedric died in the tournament later that year, she may not have believed whoever did tell her, Harry quietly reminded, abruptly stopping their amusement. Really, it's probably better anyways than trying to force 3 beds into one room rather than just letting them stay on the sofas, Lily agreed. Merlin's beard. She is turning into Mrs. Weasley, Remus muttered, looking more amused than anything while Lily sighed heavily. Why couldn't her son enjoy this safety like so many were denied? At least you've had plenty of practice for those quick escapes, Sirius snorted. That's sure to come in handy eventually. I hope someone somehow got word to Xenophilius's daughter's okay, Lily whispered to no one in particular. No matter what he didn't deserve to live on in fear while Luna was safe. Daddy also thinks he can stop 3 formidable teenagers with Plimply soup, so, James muttered without any heat. What was she doing there anyways? Lily muttered long after the fact, but it hadn't really been prudent to question at the time. I'm sure the Death Eaters at the school, the Carrows right, recognized her as one who's been around Harry. When he went to the Department of Mysteries, that night they all broke into the school, Sirius ticked off on his fingers. Even if she knew nothing about where Harry was, they knew they had someone important enough not to just leave around, I guess. He regretted this little analysis the second he caught sight of Harry's face, and wished he could take it back. His pup didn't need any reminders those around him were targeted. I imagine they had more important things to discuss during the reception, James sighed. What are the odds the two knew each other before this? Sirius asked, slightly amused. Slim, Remus shrugged. Curse breakers rarely have dealings with goblins directly. It's more contract basics and discussing details with intermediaries in the middle. I'm sure that's exactly what she said, James snorted. Wait, do they know you're there? Lily asked, thinking Marley would have busted in long before now if that were the case. I think Bill just told them Ron had been in contact and had been exposed, Harry recalled. He never said anything in detail, which we were grateful for, otherwise Mrs. Weasley would have never let us leave again. As to be expected, Sirius smirked. Damn, and I really wanted to hear this, James said with an uneasy laugh, all of them noticing the very consternated look on Harry's face and immediately imagining another attack already. Coward, Sirius snarled at once, his faith in this plan they were concocting melting by the second. Remus tensed up so painfully in surprise he may have just dodged a deadly curse. He'd been keeping track of Harry's passing time, better than the others he was sure, and couldn't help but notice it had been at least 9 months since the wedding, if not drawing very near. He wondered if they even realized this same fear or his abrupt presence in general had them all finally looking as worried as he felt. But he wasn't going to sit around and ramble about this when an answer may be so close at hand. Mooney, James whispered, with an equal amount of fear in that heart, stopping second to that of everything Harry had been through. He didn't know if he could go through all of this again so soon. Remus, appearing on the doorstep, dripping in blood, only to drop dead like everyone he'd ever cared about. Well, that wasn't the reaction anyone was expecting. Lily squealed in delight and got up, all but dancing to his side to hug him while half shouting in his ear, "Oh, I wish you'd glow like that now, love. You really deserve it." Remus tried to pull away at first just to save his hearing, but then changed his mind and hugged her tightly anyway, senses be damned. He looked to Prongs and tried to think of something to say, anything to help sort out the jumble of emotions in him. They had known from the start what a miracle this was, and surely he wouldn't be shouting so deliriously happy if the child from his nightmares were a reality. He was clearly the only one still doubting this, though. Sirius looked indulgent of this new hope he couldn't bother to hide, and Harry and James were beaming for him. "Oh, keep going, will you?" Lily pleaded, trying to budge him to the side and peek around him. "I want details. Ted, that's so adorable." Like a little teddy bear, I'm betting that was your idea and Tonks just loved it. She giggled at her own idea, and Remus kept going tentatively, trying his hardest to keep a sense of calm and realism in his voice. This could all still go wrong, but even he was losing that battle now. In his defense, what real experience has he had with them? James snorted. "Finally, someone gets something they deserve in this future," Sirius whispered, and thankfully went unheard in the parents' jubilant noise, clearly making up for Remus' edgy response. It was clearly a great effort on his part to not break out into this same emotion now, and they weren't going to let it last. "That's because it happened because of you," James told Harry with pure sincerity. Harry flushed slightly, which only doubled when Remus stammered out the next line. "No better choice," Remus said while meeting Harry's eyes. At least that was something he couldn't look on with regret for. "Look who's taken to calling her Dora now." Sirius burst out laughing in surprise. "That's the last thing he needs," James said at once. At the same time, Lily said, "That's exactly what he'll be needing." Then the two burst out laughing even harder. "Am I the only one over here laughing?" Mooney has zero reaction to Harry being there, Sirius asked. "Clearly Bill did let word out in the order about you three, and Remus got lucky on this timing." "What was the date?" Lily suddenly demanded. "April 3rd, Harry said after a moment of thought. "Thanks, love," she cheered, clearly marking that down in her memory. "Lily," Remus protested. She was starting to get ridiculous. "This is not going to happen the same way twice. Merlin, you're assuming I'll still." He trailed off pitifully. He looked towards the stairs once more, and could no longer pretend even to himself he dreamed of having one of his own. "You think he inherited that?" James burst out laughing in surprise. "Don't some kids' features just change a bit when they're born anyways?" Harry's eyes were blue for months before they finally changed to green. "I think Mooney's just getting some wishful thinking that baby's nothing like him," Sirius scoffed. "Here I'm hoping for the exact opposite." Remus still flinched. Harry had not said if it was a full moon or not, nor did he pay attention to such things, but he didn't think he was out of the woods yet. It was a lie now, to tell himself he was still being cautious about all of this, or to even think he'd be lucky twice, and the baby would not be born with his past on affliction. Remus still couldn't help one last wince, even as he let himself feel the unparalleled joy galloping through him. He'd already failed one family, could he make it right with another? Lily gave Remus one last hug before finally going back over to Harry. The Lupin of his memories had never been so content in Harry's life, except that moment. At least Harry could finally hope that would change for the better now. He hoped the sense of foreboding still within him was for the Gringotts' break-in to come, and that he'd get to see his godchild growing with his family very soon. Not another Marley lecture, James sighed. How many can he get? He honestly just didn't even want to change the subject. He wanted to sit around for hours, cooing over this new precious life of his nephew and glorying in this with one of his best friends like they had for him. James wished they could just treasure this a few moments longer, but didn't speak aloud, for then they'd never be able to keep going. It's as if they'd been secretive about it or something. Sirius snorted. I know I wouldn't have waited around to hear the whole thing, James agreed. Must you use that metaphor of all things? Lily grumbled with a slight pout, still trying to cling to the happy feelings in them without being reminded of her son's looming fate. She wished she could go upstairs now, bring him down here again so he could revel in these light-hearted feelings once more, but she wasn't going to delude herself it was going to last. Right, Remus drew the word out distractedly. I think I found the only other person besides Hermione who paid even a bit of attention in that class, Sirius snorted. Wouldn't there be some kind of, I don't know, contract or something working these details out? James spluttered in surprise for such a harsh view. Surely both parties know what they're getting into when this exchange is happening. Maybe, back when they were all commissioned, it was a bit more murky, or even this was intended and never acted out due to foul play. Remus offered. These are so rare nowadays because of reasons like this. Goblins have refused to make them for us anymore, and these have been passed down through so many families. It's just sort of something that exists without a resolution. It's likely not that hard to work out. Lily snorted. Oh, that choice of words, Sirius said to the ceiling, hands clasped together in thanks as he didn't bother to smother one bit of laughter. Remus finished with a huff of breath he'd been holding in since Tonk's pregnancy had been announced. He couldn't look at Harry and Sirius, suddenly unable to look at each other as the shame of their own thoughts was made all too clear, or Lily and James, still trying to hold their overwhelming pleasure for Remus getting to experience the joy of their life in his future. He just ran his hand over the next page, fighting back his own waves of worry on how that story had ended and hoping history wouldn't repeat itself. HPHPHPHPHPHP asterisk, and if that doesn't describe Lupin's status in these books, I don't know what does. Pop in to announce important things, then leave again for the rest of the series. What? No, I'm not bitter that my favorite character doesn't get more attention or a prequel. Still not a Remus Tonks fan anyways, no matter how cute this is. The last time we saw Remus actually, genuinely smiling and happy was back in Grimmauld Place's fire when he was reminiscing about James. Then, over 2 years later, he genuinely is happy for the life of his child. But I never felt he loved Tonks. J.K. went out of her way more to show Bill and Fleur having a romance than the main character's godson's parents. It all happened entirely off-screen, and I have no idea why it exists, except for an admittedly adorable parallel. I honestly think he got together with her because she wanted to, and he got tired of telling her no. He said it himself, this was all against his better judgment. So no, I never felt like he loved her, though I do not by any means underestimate he loved his child. Still a Wolfstar fan, because at least we see them spend time together. But the Remus/Tonks pairing has led me to a really cool idea when I finally get to my O. Chapter 26, Gringotts. Chapter text in the time it took Lily to get up and take the book from Remus. She already had a rather fixed smile replacing her jubilation from Remus' announcement. What she wouldn't give to sit around all day, laughing and hearing of this kind of news while watching her own son rather than the knowledge they were going on with in Harry attempting to rob a Gringotts vault. The idea was madness, but then so was everything else they'd been hearing about in these days past. So she cleared her throat and prepared herself for more insanity to come. Sirius' mind had already been filled with dread from the mere idea of this. Now, his mouth was already hanging open just from the one nugget he'd heard of all this. I've found the way I'm going to live through this, he pleasantly told his friends, being the first to put himself back together from whatever insanity this was, by always taking comfort in the fact that Harry should never be involved in any plans, ever. Hey. Harry protested, the plan solidifying easily in his mind now this morning and launching into the details. Oh, bloody hell, Lily whispered. You'll be lucky to make it past the front door. Harry scowled at the lot of them while he felt the heat rising to his face. Even with an inside man, he couldn't deny it was all likely to go sideways, given his track record, and there wasn't anything in him promising otherwise. I've said it before, And I will say it again, James smirked. Have far more restraint than I ever will, Harry. It would be like the ultimate I told you so back to her. Sirius sighed. There's a good time for that, Remus chuckled. Any time you're in the room, Moony, Sirius snorted. That helps nothing, Lily snarled. Whatever humor they'd been pretending at dying like that wand had helped to do. The known, the unspeakable, and all yet to come, James quietly agreed. What do you mean I don't still cross your mind every 5 seconds? Sirius Mark pouted. I'm game, Remus said at once. You can ambush someone else and steal a wand. Can't deny his priorities, though, James beamed. Right, that one's had a bit of an interesting history as well, Remus grumbled, making Hermione's teeth grow, disarming Dumbledore, plenty of highlight awful moments. Harry frowned in Remus' direction for some reason, but Lily had ignored him, and Harry paid her more attention. That was just rude, Harry, Lily snorted. I couldn't help it, Harry shrugged. After what Bill said, he shook his head, looking more troubled by the moment. James couldn't believe how they thought they were going to pull this off when they couldn't trust each other, but still tried to soothe. I guess it doesn't make a real difference. Even if you did nothing but keep it in Hermione's bag all this time, I wouldn't put it past Griffook to steal that if he thought you were playing him, so it's a moot point. Harry didn't look particularly comforted. I thought the snatchers were just too polite to take a lady's purse, Remus snorted, as it hadn't even occurred to them she'd lost it. Did Bill and Fleur just unofficially adopt those two? Lily couldn't help but ask with fond amusement. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but I've just realized they don't really have anywhere else to go, do they? I know we would, James said without a second thought. In that sort of climate, he'd be coming home at least once a week with another kid he'd found trying to escape this forsaken world. You mean you aren't just going to walk right out of Gringotts and disapparate away from him? Sirius asked Mark politely. Whatever could go wrong with that plan? Harry grit his teeth and ignored him even more. He couldn't even snap back at Sirius. He'd endure whatever his godfather in particular wanted to mock him for just so he wouldn't try to go running and screaming from the room again. Well, there's an interesting thought at least, James snickered. How on earth did you ever live without him? Remus snorted. Proving that your mood really doesn't have an outcome on future events, I should demand a refund from Trelawney. Sirius rolled his eyes. It helped even less no one in here was bothering with the false promise otherwise. They were all painfully aware of the dwindling number of pages, that very soon something irreversible had happened to Harry, and none of them wanted to entertain the idea of what he'd suffered through. Exactly what had gone wrong for him to end up here like he was. You can always stay along the coast more, James offered in some consolation, as the desolate look on Harry continued to grow, and he couldn't just stay silent through that. Yeah, Harry tried to agree with enthusiasm, but there was a tight ball of worry resting in him now that he couldn't shake. Why did he get the feeling they were never going to get to use that new tent, not worry any more about where they'd be staying at all? What happened at Gringotts? I think I've finally found the moment I hate Hermione the most, and it's not even her. Sirius agreed, all of them suppressing their own shivers. I'm really wanting to try Polyjuice more every time you describe it, Sirius told him, just to see if he could see the same in those he knew. Is that as bad as, or on level with, the cat? Remus asked with amusement. Clearly the level to live by is Harry's, Lily reminded with a chuckle. Really my favorite aspect of this plan. Wish we'd thought of those kinds of disguises more often, Sirius grinned. Sounds nothing like him, James agreed at least. I'm sure that broke his heart to pieces. Sirius sniffled. Right before such a mad stunt, Harry, I'm ashamed of you. Don't you know this is where you're supposed to declare your undying love? James busted out laughing. I imagine that's something he doesn't experience often, Remus said with sympathy, and hasn't had very good experiences with wizards doing that to him in the past. Sirius' innards quivered with unease once more. Even knowing what had gone wrong the last time Harry was in this place, he couldn't help thinking this was all going to get even worse than Death Eaters appearing. Actually, he already knew it was going to be worse, considering he knew better than any of them what was waiting below their feet. Her perfect world, Remus muttered in disgust. Nice acting advice, Sirius appraised critically. Could use a bit more bloodthirsty nature as well. Literally no one asked your opinion on this, Lily groaned. Harry's breath caught in his throat as memory of this place washed over him. How was it possible everything in his life from his 11th birthday had changed? Lily's heart plummeted. This was finally worse than the Diagon Alley of their time. Last year had been more accurate than this wasteland. Even just describing it put nothing but fear and terror in them all, a place they'd visited for countless years. It wasn't right. I'm guessing that's how he got such a thing in the first place, Remus whispered. Lily's mind flashed back to the ministry, to Umbridge sentencing people to this life left and right, and her blood boiled furiously for this poor man being reduced to such a miserable existence. What she wouldn't give to strike down every single person who had done this. James couldn't help the abstract thought Hermione wasn't doing good at staying in character. Bellatrix would have more likely cut that man where he stood like Darby all over again, but it was probably better she didn't get too lost in character. I really don't see what else you could try, James sighed, speaking why at least he'd never bothered to offer Harry a better plan. He didn't have one. This was unimaginable to them to even joke about, let alone attempting it like Harry was. I'm still all for it, Sirius said at once. Then you'd have to live up to the build-up twice, James gasped. Come on, Pads, let's get it all out of the way at once. That didn't make me feel better, Sirius huffed. They couldn't immediately place the name either, but anyone who called Bellatrix by such a proper title they automatically disliked. Now she's getting into the spirit. Sirius Mark cheered. I'm sure she drew on her years of experience in yelling at the twins, Remus muttered. I still don't see how she'd change anything. That's exactly how Bellatrix has always been, Sirius huffed. Damn, there really are too many to keep track of now, James spat. At this rate, he was tempted to start a detailed list. Lily twitched uneasily, the book nearly slipping from her hand as she was already envisioning Voldemort showing up here next. Did this Travers have the same clout, the same dark mark that would haunt Harry everywhere? Bloody hell, James breathed in relief. That girl's finally able to do some damn good on the spot lying, and I hate it. How is it she manages this best around people I loathe the most? Sirius muttered in admiration. Now I'm just imagining a Death Eater gossiper getting killed for this false advertising, Remus muttered. Really went all out with that backstory, eh? Sirius burst out laughing. We can't all be Snuffles from Tibet. Harry rolled his eyes. Lily looked torn between laughing and rolling her eyes. James had no such reserves and snickered heavily. This is possibly the weirdest thing I've ever had to hear of Harry doing, Remus said with a torn expression. Chatting up a Death Eater, I can't imagine having to keep up a casual conversation period. Not a surprise from you, Moony, Sirius snorted. I disagree. I think Voldemort would top this, or the dragon, or Remus elbowed him hard to get him to stop. At least something can go off without a hitch, Lily said with half a smile, her hands still tense along the book's spine, the real giveaway how uneasy she still was. They remembered. It had been something they'd never looked twice at, except Lily, who just loved the poem for fun. Never something to consider, really, as much as something to laugh at for it being needed, as telling you not to raise a baby dragon in a wooden hut. It should go without saying. James could still remember being the one to describe every vivid detail to those around him. It had been an indescribable moment of joy, hearing and feeling firsthand what his son's first magical experience in their world had been like. Now he was here, listening to his wife try not to have a heart attack because their boy had to steal a piece of Voldemort's soul. The two beside each other in his mind nearly drove him to insanity. I don't remember you mentioning that, Remus yelped. Because Griffook didn't, Harry agreed in as calm a voice as he could. He had to try and be the level-headed one here. The others were all being so jittery it would be a miracle if they could get through all of this without someone screaming their head off by the end. Wano. Is he mad? Serious protests died on his lips as he watched Harry like a goblin was still hanging from his back. Harry James, James shouted, and Harry cringed as his prediction came true. When did it become acceptable to use those the second things went sideways? Harry tried to defend. I panicked. We had to— No, Lily cut in with finality. We didn't say a bloody word about this madness because we understand why you had to, but this is crossing the line, Harry. He sat back with a sigh, trying to fight off the well of hurt as he realized he'd disappointed them. He, surprisingly to him, didn't experience it much through this and could think of nothing else but to apologize quietly. There was nothing else he could say. Lily relented and kept going, but her tone was even more frustrated than when she'd started. She didn't want him to ever think using an unforgivable curse as a first impulse in any situation should be condoned. This is the time where robes should be worn on all occasions, so you can kick someone without it being so obvious, Sirius muttered. Harry cringed and waited for another outburst, but to his relief, his parents' expressions just tightened, but they didn't yell at him again. Sirius had once impressed upon him enough that Harry seemed unlikely to ever consider it again in here anyways, so they weren't going to badger him about what was done. A first for her, I'm sure, Remus muttered. Sirius shivered in disgust. He should have known something had been wrong that day when the goblins slipped into the cart, first with those as they were leaving, instead of waiting until everyone was in like the usual policy. I swear I will never go on a raid with you lot in my life, James sighed. Harry arched a brow at him and stated, must be nice to have some instruction on what not to do when you lot try this. I'll just be at home babysitting then, shall I? At least Sirius laughed in surprise, while James rolled his eyes. Couldn't hardly leave him back there at this rate, Remus agreed wearily. Oh, really, are you sure? Sirius demanded. I didn't quite pick up on that myself. I'll consider that a good thing, Lily sighed. Would you have rather I just bashed them over the head and made a run for it? Harry demanded. I'd have rather you didn't use dark magic to fix your problems, whatever other impulse you had, Lily said stoutly. James watched the indecision on Harry's face, the clear regret he had of doing this to someone warring with his need to get the job done. It was loathsome to his core. Bellatrix had given more to Harry's life than he ever had, but he still thanked this life Harry had learned this in any sense, and could never fully develop this spell as it was meant. I'm guessing reinforcements, lots of insanity, maybe a bit more carnage, Remus ticked off on his fingers. It really depends on what they suspect is going on. Kinder than I might have been, Sirius muttered viciously. I was considering him as bait. Sirius, Remus smacked him on the shoulder. That's not helping when we're trying to convince Harry dark magic isn't needed to get this done. Murder's usually considered just as bad. Sirius rubbed his shoulder and tried to fake some remorse for the bleak joke, but at least Harry got a small laugh out of it. How long will that last? James asked curiously. Not long, my guess anyways. Harry didn't seem to put much force into the spell, Lily said with just a touch of relief. The plan was already screwed anyways. The worst he could do was shake it off and just let more people know. Did you ever learn the real difference between those and stalagmites? Remus asked with a forced bit of amusement. I don't think it ever crossed my mind again, honestly. That's just the kind of teacher Hagrid was, Harry said sagely. Hindsight is 50-50, James agreed. You mean 20-20, dear, Lily corrected. That doesn't make sense. 100's the best score, James frowned at her. She just shook her head as answer and promised to explain later. Lily came to a breathless stop just to come to terms with that. That's new, Remus finally said lamely. Thankfully, it doesn't steal those away. If you'd been wearing it still, it just would have come off. Well, I assume. Now, I'm not so sure, James finished with a curious expression. You're not flooding this house to find out, Lily said without looking up. The yard, then, Sirius concluded. If Lily wasn't so invested in this, sympathy or not for him going through this, she would have gotten up to smack him. Harry watched his dad grind his teeth and his mum look as uneasy as ever. But at this rate, it hadn't even crossed his mind to do something else to persuade the goblin. They needed to get out of there. I still can't believe you ever thought you could just walk out the front door. Remus groaned, but tried to keep to himself. I don't think invoking my spirit will be of much help this time, Harry, Sirius muttered quietly, shrinking farther back into his seat with every word now. Sirius was taking several deep breaths now, willing himself not to vomit. It's not so bad, he kept chanting to himself. You've lived through much worse. It's not so bad. But bad enough was the nasty intrusion, as Lily gave a far too vivid description to him he had no need of. Lily's voice was shaking by the end, just as bad. The last dragon he'd been around had been plenty awful. She couldn't decide if this was better or worse, because he was voluntarily around this one. Remus was rubbing Sirius back and whispering animatedly about that time. The two of them made a very botched attempt at lifting Flitwick's desk to the Ravenclaw common room as a distraction. Sirius hadn't collapsed yet, so he was confident it was at least helping. James was the only one who was at least pretending to keep his calm. That or he'd just frozen in place with a forced smile expression. Harry couldn't tell any more. Remus stopped for a second to scowl slightly at the book, not at all appreciating the implications of all that. The description sounded like a cranian iron belly to him. That particular breed didn't have the best eyesight anyways, and for them to go farther with it by blinding the poor beast Sirius made a guttural noise like he was going to start screaming any second when he'd stopped, so he went back to his kind movements. Sirius still remembered that noise like it was reverberating through his bones, but though he shivered harder than ever and leaned all the closer to his friend, he'd been right. He'd take the feeling of revisiting this nightmare from his memories 1,000 times more if it helped his family. Some of Lily's fear at Harry being the one to witness this began to thaw, and ire grew in place. The Dragon Research and Restraint Bureau had never made a trip to Gringotts as far as she was aware. The goblins had their own rules and regulations, but maybe they should look into this. That shouldn't be allowed. Assuming one was in there at all, James still couldn't help the little pessimistic thought, half hoping it wasn't at this rate. Yes, Harry would have pulled this dangerous stunt for nothing, but bloody hell, this was not something any of them wanted to try recreating. Lily nearly startled out of her seat, imagining the dragon forcing its way in and burning them all, the goblins stabbing them in the back literally, any number of awful things to add to this nightmare. He's just a wealth of information after the fact. James snarled. Right, so no handling of the treasure. They weren't planning on diving into it anyways, Remus sycophantically agreed. Sirius was already sweating without the vivid description. He kept having to blink more than was needed anyways to keep the vision of bright red flames from his eyes and the echo of the dragon's roar out of his ears. Hearing Lily half screech, all this wasn't helping. Funny how Bellatrix of all Death Eaters got that one, James muttered, though there was nothing funny at all about any of this. Nobody thought to bring a ladder in that bloody magical bag. Remus demanded. That girl's truly lost her mind, Lily groaned. Levicorpus is a non-verbal spell, but the right idea, James quickly agreed, waving her on and trying to pretend like he wasn't fanning his face as well from stress. Neither of his parents bothered to point out again Harry's incorrect use of the spell. They were just grateful it worked even improperly, for which he was grateful as he swiped more sweat from his forehead. The incorrect method for using it had only added to their panic and their problems. That bloody dildo. Sirius managed to find his tongue again, and a string of curses enacted on that goblin followed for this. They hadn't had to bring this goblin along at all. They'd trusted him, and this is what they got for it. If Harry or any of them were hurt during this because of this creature, he'd go down there himself just to feed Griffook to that dragon. Lily nearly dropped the book and grabbed Harry's hands to check for herself he was all right. Her brain still half convinced the object was going to start scolding her any second as this poured down around them. Sirius eyed Harry with the same expression he once had the creatures of his nightmares. Madness indeed. Why was it any time Harry said that he found himself agreeing? Lily did drop the book then with a shriek, her hands spasming to grab her son away or join him, she didn't know. James wasn't having that and lunged for the book. In a blind panic of just seeing something move, Lily accidentally shot a stinging hex at him with her wand, and the two sat there eyeing each other for a moment before Lily collected herself enough to keep going. Sirius actually fainted for a second, he'd swear it. His vision went out. His brain could not process what he was hearing. What was there even to say for his godson anymore? Well, that's one way to do it, Lily finished with a whisper. HP Narutov and 8,762 Bellatrix Lestrin. The only Death Eater loyal to Voldemort after his defeat was give Hufflepuff's cup to protect. Whether on purpose or not, I find it quite interesting. Is my hyper-obsession with this series showing again, where I in fact envision this as the same man from that exact scene? Yes, giving me the very fun question of, what do wizards do about needing glasses? If they don't have dentists, the logical assumption is they don't have any specialized doctors. Healers of wounds seems to be it. Then how do purebloods that need glasses get by? I imagine there's a place in Diagon Alley you can go, stick your face in something, and a pair of glasses magically pop out with your prescription. But that's as far as my imagination's ever gone as far as an explanation. Chapter 27. The Final Hiding Place. Chapter text, The Final Countdown, begins with the final hiding place. I couldn't have asked for better. HP. The amount of disbelief that still hung in the air from what their boy did was still pretty close to indescribable. At some point, Lily had gotten through it, and then sat there staring at Harry for Merlin knew how long. It really just kept getting crazier with him, and she was genuinely afraid by now how much worse it could still get. James was still watching Sirius, whom aside from his one outburst had been suspiciously quiet through the majority of that. Mooney had kept him calm enough he didn't have an entire freak out, but they needed Padfoot to keep breathing normally to continue. So he accepted the book from Lily and began mark reading. And then Harry woke up, and it was all a dream. They still needed to go do the Gringotts caper ouch. Sirius was already aiming carefully with another pillow. How do you think that would help Prongs? Oh, the brilliant plan all along was to disguise themselves as Dumbledore, and the power of his ghost would fix everything. Glad to see you're feeling better, James smirked without remorse as he began properly. There's that, yeah, I can't blame you for, Remus stuttered. The impossibility of it all still hadn't seemed to sink in yet. She was afraid of heights, James recalled. I doubt this helped much. It didn't help me any. Sirius was still screaming. Can you blame it? Lily sighed. Luck and more cushioning charms, Remus offered. About 4 days, Remus began before he really started to consider. But given this one was likely raised from an egg in that environment with only very rudimentary instincts to survive on now, I'd guesstimate far less, and it's most likely heading for fresh water. You think it'll survive? Lily asked sympathetically, imagining the poor thing starving to death now. That's a good question. Perhaps Ron'll get in contact with Charlie again instead. I don't care, Sirius viciously reminded, and if either of you even think of making sure this happens again, I'll disown you both. Relax, Padfoot, James chuckled. We'll run interference with the goblins while they go down there. That's not helping. Sirius scowled, while Lily smacked him and added her own scowl. I'd say he would already, but wouldn't you feel that through your scar? Lily offered. Yeah, the wizards who were in that bank were likely loyal to him. It's a miracle you haven't fallen off yet getting a vision. James agreed uneasily, as if they needed to add another worry to all of this. I suppose it is a good thing he's, never bothered to check on any of them in the few years since he's come back from the dead, Remus agreed. You'd think he would, though, Sirius muttered, anything to keep his mind off the back of that dragon. He knows about the diary, at least. You would think the obvious thing to do would be to go to the other places and see for himself after that. Maybe he did, Lily agreed. We don't know his every move. He'd have known the locket was gone, Sirius reminded, and Harry definitely would have felt that. There was a replacement in there, Lily reminded right back. If he just glanced in there, well, that could have been what it was for, to delay Voldemort noticing for a bit longer. I suppose we're about to find out, James sighed. Away, Remus said with sympathy. It's more likely to scoop a whale out of the ocean first, Lily deduced. Surely if it hadn't noticed them this long it wouldn't at all. Besides that, dragons aren't coastal creatures. There's not enough fresh water to sustain their diets. It's more likely this one's heading to a mountainous region, Remus began to explain, before Sirius clapped his hands over his ears and again shouted at them to stop with the dragon fun facts. They were all starting to grow a bit worried with how much time was slipping by. How much longer did they have? Why was it taking so long for Voldemort to react to this? Could his friends save him if Harry fell from the dragon's back? James took a deep breath, preparing himself for this plunge. This was either going to get his son out of this problem or make it significantly worse. He really didn't think he'd survive the dragon mistaking them for fish and start swooping into the water after them. James swore a more relived gust of air had yet burst out of him. If he could just hold on to that feeling for the remainder of this, he might live through it yet. All of them winced at the idea of having to be dragged through the air, feeling that while clinging to a dragon. Bloody priorities, Sirius couldn't stop himself scoffing. Please tell me someone bothered to pack food this time. Harry didn't answer. He'd been so focused on breaking into Gringotts, he still hadn't paid much mind to if Hermione had restocked her bag with more essentials, like food. Lily bit her lip to stop herself, pointing out they'd been planning on double-crossing him, if not in the same way. Tempting idea, really. James couldn't help the dripping sarcasm. Maybe fashion it into another ring now. I've got it. A belt. Nice old buckle that would be. Have a whole wardrobe of Horcruxes. What more could you ask for? Remus agreed deadpan. Is that such a bad thing? Remus asked. Yes, his two friends said without hesitation. All five of them burst out laughing so hard, tears quickly clouded up James' vision. Sirius succumbed the hardest, finally losing his will to stay upright and nearly falling off his seat as relief took over the adrenaline of what they'd had to hear, let alone live through. By the time James had got his breath back enough to keep going, he still had to stop with intermittent giggles that only died off as talk of Voldemort resurfaced once more. Why would someone try to imitate me hiccuping? There are far more fun things you could pretend to be me doing. Harry still laughed dutifully, and the others felt bad enough for him after that Gringotts mess. They just ignored him. I can't see that happening, Remus sighed in disagreement. Between Voldemort using occlumency to get the whole story himself and the goblins doing an inventory of the vault for safety, yeah, he'll know. They all shifted anxiously for that being confirmed. The element of surprise had given Harry time to do this. What would happen now that the Horcruxes were out of the bag? Harry hissed in pain now, clutching his scar and refusing to let himself black out. The memory of the pain sufficed enough to remind him of this, but moments like these, he was more grateful than ever he didn't relive it entirely. Dumbledore has a bad habit of doing that, Sirius said, loath to agree with Voldemort on anything, but the secret animgus who had been found out by the same man always did seem to have his ways. James's stomach rolled at having to describe this once more. Even when it was not his death, even when describing this of people he loathed, no part of him could ever say this with anything but dread. Sirius twitched in disgust. What he wouldn't give to do the same to them, to the ones who actually deserved it. Lily shivered for a few more moments before forcing out, "Well, some good came of," she stuttered, and couldn't keep going for a moment, having to describe those deaths as good. But she still finished gallantly. "At least you'll know what, and where the last one is." Harry tried to nod in agreement, but his movements felt stiff and involuntary, lost in someone else's thoughts as he was. I can't even be surprised how fast he got there. He's been shown to have some minor intelligence doing all this. Remus didn't look any happier for the backhanded compliment. At least he never put that to use when hiding them, Sirius shrugged. Really doesn't think much of himself, does he? James huffed. Harry opened his mouth to correct Snape had done that, giving the order didn't count, but then just as quickly closed his mouth as everyone knew the distinction, and it just made his mind sting to recall it. All five of them flinched again, the casual mention of this still leaving a mark on their souls. Remus rolled his eyes heavily, even if he was still fighting the urge to be sick. Because when you decided to become a megalomaniac, Dumbledore traced your middle and last name and found them to be connected to the same village. Oh, the shocking horror. That one is a bit more loose, I admit, Lily conceded. If Dumbledore hadn't done so much digging into that orphanage and known what he had, that would have never been found. Or Voldemort hadn't underestimated ourselves, Sirius finished brutally. Sirius gave a mechanical laugh that sounded painful and stopped quickly as he clutched his hand around nothing, but still imagining the kid he hadn't saved. So he did hide one in Hogwarts, James said mildly. There was no true surprise as they'd thought Harry was right. I do love, he named what the other two were but couldn't bother with this one. Sirius threw his hands up in exasperation. I'm just trying to guess if he really did find some place nobody else had. Remus frowned. The Chamber of Secrets, or maybe somewhere in the Forbidden Forest. Conceited old git, Lily concluded, as both had been heavily explored by the boys in this room. She herself had discovered secrets of Hogwarts in the dungeons. She'd explored so much with her old friend that weren't exactly common knowledge. Collectively, they did know every corner of Hogwarts and still wouldn't claim to have discovered every detail. The one that nearly blew off Dumbledore's hand is the least secure. James confirmed with clear dubiousness. I'd really rather not rank these if we can please, Lily sighed. Remus made a frustrated noise as he couldn't help but agree with Sirius now. It's as if he was going out of his way not to say what it was and where. Malfoy, yes, but surprisingly Bellatrix didn't do anything wrong in this instance, except letting a piece of her hair get on a mudblood, Lily said stoutly. She watched the boys flinch with unease at her casual use of the word and felt bad for it, but rather liked Hermione's empowerment of taking that word and not letting others define it. Harry watched his parents give another uneasy shiver if this had happened before Harry had jumped free of the dragon. At least, that had been one catastrophe he missed. I really don't get angry all that much, actually, Sirius happily inserted, while James was already over his pity and made to get up and smack him once more for that insistent joke. Remus did it for him, allowing James to continue. Of course not. That would be too easy, Lily groaned. Fingers crossed nobody ever boarded up the secret entrances in Honeydukes and the shack, Sirius said quietly. Snape had a suspicion about the first, and Flat knew about the second, so his hopes weren't high, not to mention the twins had already confirmed the others were out of commission, thanks to Filch. Sirius shivered one last time and groaned aloud. I don't care if you have to face Voldemort one-on-one next. Please let there not be another dragon. Lily couldn't help but grin at him and tease. Now I'm imagining Norbert gets to make a reappearance. Maybe Hagrid and Charlie come in riding her. Arg, Sirius snarled, fighting back the impulse to curse her. She or James would not appreciate that, and he didn't want to miss what really did happen, so with great self-restraint stopped himself. James' hand was trembling just slightly as he finished. Through all the chaos they'd heard so far, it was still impossible to imagine what could come next. HP, I'll admit, the movie actually had a funnier line about Harry pointing out there was no need to make a plan, as none of theirs ever actually worked out. 10. Chapter 28, The Missing Mirror. Chapter text Sirius still held the belief that anything would be better going forward than what they'd left behind so long as no more dragons were involved. It didn't make him feel any better about what he was opening the book up to. Harry and Voldemort were about to have a race to that castle, and Merlin knew what would happen when they collided, but it wasn't going to be pretty. The Marauders didn't need it described any further. More than Lily, Harry, and many other Hogwarts students combined, they knew every detail of this place, every curve in the road, every building in as intricate detail as those who lived there, along with the surrounding mountains and forestry. This had been their freedom from everything, and most days they still missed it like a friend they'd left behind. Lily made a soft, hissing noise of distress. It can't ever be easy, can it? Never, Harry agreed, still rubbing his ears now. Sirius thought he'd gone mad for a moment as he imagined such a thing. Hogwarts and the surrounding village was supposed to be a safe harbor. Dumbledore himself may have let a Death Eater teach there, but at least that still had the illusion as being under control of the situation. Now all they had left to them was this mess to contend with. A fact we only recently learned, James snorted. Would have been nice to know long ago, though. Well, I'm so sorry we never practiced shooting spells at each other under the priceless heirloom cloak, Remus rolled his eyes. It'll only happen again, no matter what time you come back, Lily reminded, her lips already trembling and white from the stress of what he was doing. Best to get it done now. Try apparating even closer to the school's gates. I'll bet you they've found a way to stop us leaving again, Harry said quietly, and nobody argued that point. The totalitarian way this was being controlled made it a miracle he'd been able to apparate at all. It was likely a trap he couldn't just slip back out of. Sirius felt his whole life shivering before him. The threat of that hanging over him for so many days could never be fully shaken off. Now for Harry to be in jeopardy of this could not be tolerated. Harry knew a gut-wrenching pain for Darby once more, watching his godfather panic his way through this and wishing he'd thought of him in that moment. Maybe then Creature could have come to mind. There still would have been a way out of this. It was Sirius' worst nightmare. He and Harry, cornered by these once more with no time magic to save them this time. Only holding on to the book as tight as humanly possible and finding the next word saved him from slipping into a screaming fit. Harry felt more than saw his parents remain tense, but it was just slightly less than moments ago. He already knew they felt the same as him. They'd rather see him battle his way through an army of Death Eaters than succumb to a Dementor. That didn't sound like Rosmerta, Remus finally said into the odd silence. I don't care if it's that old arse from the Hog's Head. At least someone's still helping out Harry, James said in relief. Ha, James muttered, while the others around him snickered for his eerily good guess. Who do you suppose that is? Sirius asked with exaggerated curiosity. Half to cover his ghastly reaction from those beasts before, and half genuine because they'd never been up here and were now intensely curious. My money's on Alberta Tootil, James smirked. He seems like the kind of fellow who would appreciate a woman with a good blasting curse. Have I mentioned how much I regret you not being at school this year? Sirius chuckled. Just for not getting to witness all the mayhem people like him would be causing during this state of anarchy. Harry didn't disagree, but didn't see arguing the point. So, what was it? James asked in confusion, thinking if it had been some breed of deer he and Lily were going to be feeling even more off than ever. I couldn't get a good look, Harry admitted, but with enough confidence to tell his dad. Not that, though. They needed Harry's little startle of surprise to draw their attention to what they would have thought was just a random bit of decoration, but still no more understood Harry's suddenly scrutinizing look. That would take far too long to explain, James sighed. Do you think he'd take a thank you and move on? What are you on about? Sirius scoffed. We're here to find a bit of Voldemort's soul. Mind if we camp out here until daybreak when that bloody curfew lifts? Why do we keep you around? Remus groaned. I swear you'd be caught the first day this shite exploded. Sirius only looked mildly offended before deciding to ignore him. Clearly he just loves to be bathed in gratification. Lily gave an uneasy giggle. No way, Sirius breathed. Whatever scenarios they'd been trying to imagine, this had not been one. But why? James was left a spluttering mess with no actual question coming. I thought that was with me, Sirius finally whispered what they were all thinking. They dismissed Harry seeing any such thing all this time because it hadn't been possible. Now they were faced with a very different fact, one that could possibly mean, I must have been wrong. Harry finally broke the awkward silence. I just thought that when. He finally trailed off, hating himself for being the reason whatever last-ditch hope had been sprung up was doused just as fast. He did not want to make it even worse by harboring false hopes, though, so finished brutally. I'm sure I demand to know how he got such a thing. So, he waved Sirius on, who kept eyeing his hands for a few more seconds to make sure they weren't going to vanish from existence before he could. They did not need the reminder of what all she'd done to Harry's life. Evidence sat right in front of them now. What the why would you think when did you? Harry felt bad for his dad, who was still struggling to say anything coherent. His mother seemed beyond having a reaction anymore, as she stayed stiff in her seat and couldn't seem to let her mind go 1 second ahead, afraid she'd miss something even more vital if she did. Remus was stuck in a state of wonder as he went back and thought through it all. Of so many years laughing at this strange old man in the village, never realizing the connection to their headmaster. The two apparently hated each other for some reason. Had they put water under the bridge at some point? If so, then why still did Dumbledore never speak of him? Why did Aberforth never come up to the castle for a few visits? Sirius was more than aghast enough for all of them to verbalize it. How is it actually possible there was an answer literally right in front of us the whole time, and we still didn't know? Again, all this time you've been wondering and begging for answers, or a clue, or anything, and this old fart's just been hanging around here feeding a cat with my mirror. He was breathing rather heavily by the end, hurt and strung out from too many knocks to their world view. He didn't need Harry to convince him to keep going now. There was a demented sort of determination driving him now to finally get some answers. But why? Lily asked quietly, still feeling the burn of her hope Sirius would spontaneously appear there as well, and trying to stave that off. We last saw him kicking Mundungus out. This doesn't seem like the kind of bloke to pick a mirror out first. I've no idea, Sirius finally said when he was expected to answer. And have any other properties. The real question is, why did he keep it this whole time now? James was getting mad now, his voice rising with every word for the sharp pain lodged in his throat. What's he been doing this whole time? Spying on Harry. Even if, by some bloody miracle, Dumbledore just happened to come by after Aberforth bought this and told his estranged brother what this was over Sunday tea, he kept it all this time just to keep an eye on Harry without ever offering any real help. He was actually shouting by the end, breath coming out a bit ragged as everything that had piled up over the course of Harry's harrowing adventure collided with this moment. Now Ron's not even paying attention, Remus grumbled, just to keep his mind on some solid fact. I want to be insulted, Sirius said, still looking mildly amused, but he's not wrong. They've had a long day, and it's fixing to be longer, Lily defended. Is that Ron's excuse for everything? James rolled his eyes. I'd like to see you do all this on an empty stomach, Sirius shrugged. He's not even going to ask why they popped in, Remus asked in surprise. It's so long into the school year, surely he knows they didn't do it just to reminisce. At least he's trying, Lily offered. Harry couldn't help an uneasy feeling at the mention of that, remembering the state Sirius was in while he was up there. Those caves weren't all that hospitable, and his friend was up there because of him. If that's what Hagrid had been living with for months, what was the fate of those inside the castle? Been there, done that. The scenery wasn't all that great, Sirius huffed. Why would you remember such a thing right now? Remus shivered. Harry gave a very sardonic laugh that was echoed all around. Nothing in his life could ever be described like that. I'm finding it harder to believe by the second these two were related, James said quietly. Maybe he's adopted. He certainly could never see eye to eye with anyone like this. Then what's he still around for? Sirius sneered in disgust. Take your chances outsmarting the Death Eaters, Harry. This old fart's not going to be doing you any good. Harry sighed and gazed around the room at the array of anger and disbelief they had for this man. He'd helped Harry, and they were grateful, but clearly to them this Dumbledore was even more questionable about trust than the last one. That's what Dumbledore did, and see how well that turned out, Remus muttered. Nobody had bothered with that preamble in here. From the beginning, they'd felt Dumbledore was hiding something about his involvement with Harry's life, and slowly that feeling had mounted to questions they never would have dreamed of thinking in their old headmaster and current leader of the Order. It had taken Harry more time than them, but his evolution in growing up and realizing that everyone had secrets had peaked during this past year of his life, and none of them liked where it seemed to be ending. Comes in handy from time to time, James whispered quietly. He'd never claimed to be a saint. He'd told plenty of lies and secrets to this day, but never to Harry. Had there ever been one person Dumbledore had told the whole truth to? Was it Grindelwald, and that had backfired on him so spectacularly? I'll bet that's a family trait, Sirius muttered, recalling that same look as he tried to buy fire whiskey at too young an age, and this old man's scrutinizing expression before kicking them all out. He tried to imagine little Ariana, but all he'd ever been able to think on her so far was a small, helpless child who needed looking after. It made perfect sense for the brothers to have gained such scrutiny over the years doing this for their sister instead. All five of them flinched at that. Those in the Order had never really questioned how much Dumbledore cared for them. They were there voluntarily to erase an evil plaguing their world. Yet look how the Order turned out. The remaining surviving original members had yet made much progress, let alone the ones from Harry's time. What had happened to Aberforth, to his own brother in Albus' quest to be rid of Voldemort? I didn't say anything, oh wait, she meant. Remus elbowed him theatrically, and Sirius gave a mock gasp of pain. It was a small, brief moment of amusement they all needed. The words burned out of Sirius like fire. For just that 1 second, he could hear his mother's words of how Muggles were primitive scum he should never acknowledge. He felt his father's wrath seeing his two sons trying to play with the local boys. He didn't want to know any more, the cruelty of children and why they'd done this. But then he took a deep breath and reminded himself he hated everyone who would go about doing this to someone they didn't like or understand. He may not like the way Muggles reacted to magic, but that didn't make wizards better about what they did with it. All James could picture was Vernon Dursley, the Muggle who made him so close to attempting murder. He didn't know where the Dumbledores had lived before relocating to Godric's Hollow, but what he wouldn't give to force those kids to see what they'd done to that child rather than have their memories erased like would have been done. Oh my goodness, Lily kept whispering, over and over like, that would somehow help her to understand this travesty of Dumbledore's past. This time Sirius hardly even blinked at the use of his given name, his mind churning with the details he was reading, hardly daring to keep going and find out more. If this had happened to his brother, any of them, well, he could hardly claim to be the man Dumbledore became. Harry felt his parents shrink closer to him, not in fright for what Ariana had become, but what had almost been Harry's life. He could still hear their anger for what the Dursleys had done to him echoing in his ears, and finally realized if he'd ever stopped having odd things happen to him, but actively tried to suppress such things as Dumbledore's little sister once had, he'd be a very different person, or not a person at all. Remus felt like he was going to be sick. He pressed his hand against his stomach the scars that lay beneath his clothes, and tried to suppress the flashbacks to his own childhood. He'd always admired Dumbledore for the way he was treated like no one, but his parents had before. Even those at St. Mungo's had never looked him in the eye. Now he knew where his beloved headmaster had learned such kind-hearted bedside manner. There was a strange sense of calm about Sirius as he said that. He vividly pictured the moment, brother and sister doing something just for them, and years later casting your soul out to protect you and finding an animal to haunt your past. He'd always loved the dog he could become for the way it could help Moony and no one else, though he'd never expected to relate to Aberforth Dumbledore of all people over this. Lily made a broken little whimper. She almost reached out to help to stop what she didn't know, but the images splashing through her mind could not go as easily as they'd come. "Why is he?" James asked quietly. He wanted to shout it, to cover his ears and hear no more, as the inevitable outcome of this danced behind his eyes. He didn't even want to help you at first, now he— "What a way to try and make me run for it," Harry offered. "All it's making me want to do is go out there and eradicate the world of Voldemort and everyone like him putting families through this, the opposite of what Aberforth's hoping for, I think." And here it came. There was no bracing themselves for what was to come next, for it took little imagination to finally pull together the bits and pieces of the story to its end. Sirius wanted to cover his own ears, would have gladly bit his tongue rather than give detail of this, but the consequences of skipping would only do to Harry what Ariana had once suffered through. Exposing one life to save another, it didn't feel better to remind himself as he kept going. I can't even imagine," Lily whispered as Sirius' voice broke on the last word. It was an unbearable thought to them, and still Dumbledore was suffering even worse. The absence of knowledge, not knowing who had done it, would have forever haunted him. It was beyond comprehension, a plight they couldn't even begin to empathize with. Harry pressed his fingers lightly to his temple now. Here he finally understood, as much as he could of a man so prominent in his life. Things he'd been yearning to know, but almost regretted learning. Yes, he did still wish he hadn't had to learn such a thing, but he did, so he'd try to do what Dumbledore would want and learn from it. That image had been scalded into their brain without question. They thought back then it was just the effects of the potion to live out a horrible scenario they would never be privy to. Now they had an answer to a question they'd never asked, and wished they could take it back. "Some days I wish we didn't have details," Remus agreed quietly. It was a nightmare no matter which angle you looked at it from, one that would have to be repeated all too soon. Harry's parents flinched. Remus and Sirius looked likely to be sick any second. Harry wondered for the millionth time in his life how different it all would have been if he'd had them in his life, to live through this with him, for just one person to see him as someone indispensable, but he had not. And still, his family did not argue with him. It tore them apart. He watched his parents nearly cry all over again to realize it one more time, but they could not bring themselves to tell Harry they saw differently. That they had once given their life for this same act, they were proud to be in the Order and let their last breath be to defy Voldemort. They'd done it for their son, though, so he wouldn't have to make this same choice, who'd willingly embraced it instead. A vicious, endless cycle there seemed no way out of. To be cowards and back out now would go against their very nature, and it was not something they could ever tell Harry to do. He did, about 20 minutes ago now," Sirius muttered through a clogged throat. His voice was starting to come out nasally as he fought to finish without sobbing his own life away. To imagine Harry as just another casualty of war as Dumbledore had seen him was not possible to him. But that's how his pup had seen himself, just like they once had. Was it right to try and convince him otherwise after he'd already lived through it all? Did I miss something?" Remus croaked, trying to pretend he hadn't spent the past half-hour fighting back yet another wave of hopeless tears for this mess of a future. The roots of its past already in so deep, there were now shadows of doubts wherever he turned any of this could change. "The same thing all of us did," Sirius promised, the other three feeling the same way without sharing a word. "Portraits can't travel through other portraits like that," James said slowly, still feeling every beat of his heavy heart, but more than willing to let his mind go to other things. "I love magic," was all Lily could think to say to that. HPHPHPHPHPHPHPHPHPHP. If you've been hearing random screaming in the distance, don't be alarmed. I had to stop every few paragraphs during this chapter just to come to terms with the fact that I had single digits left of the last book. I found yet another insane fan theory that this drink is laced with Felix Felicis, and that explains the following insanity of the last few chapters. There are an insane amount of coincidences that follow this chapter for everything to work out. But the only thing the theory leaves out is why would Aberforth do this? Was he planning to help out Harry from the moment he let them into the Hog's Head, and that's why he slipped it in? Did he just regale them with the story of Ariana to test how they'd continue the last of this adventure? I have to believe the two brothers buried water under the bridge before now for the mirror plot to make sense, so I guess Aberforth was doing his best to help Harry in any way possible. Check out the idea for yourself by Seamus Gorman and get back to me. What, me? No, I don't have the headcanon that some ancestor of Vernon was one of the Muggle kids who hurt Ariana, passing down through the line a hatred of magic. I don't have the pathological urge to connect every character together like an episode of Lost. 9.